5,000 years before the first smartphone, 4,000 years before the printing press, 3,000 years before Julius Caesar was even born. A civilization that most historians still struggle to fully explain pressed tiny wedge-shaped symbols into clay tablets and left behind something that should not exist. Not just poetry, not just tax records, not mythology dressed up as religion. A map of the solar system showing planets we did not officially discover until the 19th century. Detailed descriptions of genetic manipulation. A cosmological origin story that matches modern quantum physics more closely than it matches anything written in the Bronze Age. Medical procedures that would not reappear in human civilization for another 3,000 years. And a timeline for the end of the current age of human dominance that, depending on which translation you trust, lands somewhere between right now and the next 20 years. The Sumerians were not supposed to know any of this. They emerged in the river valleys of what is now southern Iraq around 4,500 BCE, and within a few centuries, they had invented writing, mathematics, astronomy, codified law, agriculture at scale, and a complete cosmological framework describing exactly who created humanity, why, and what comes next. Every major religion on Earth, every creation myth, every flood narrative, every story of gods walking among men traces its roots back to these clay tablets. The Bible, the Torah, the Quran, the Hindu Vedas, the Greek pantheon, all of them downstream of Sumer. But the part that keeps researchers up at night, the part that mainstream archaeology has no satisfying answer for, is the specificity. The Sumerians did not describe vague spiritual forces. They named names. They gave coordinates. They described physical beings with technology, with spacecraft, with genetic laboratories. They described a planet beyond the outer edges of our solar system with a long elliptical orbit that returns to the inner solar system on a cycle that matches geological catastrophe records almost exactly. They called those beings the Anunnaki, and they said the Anunnaki gave them everything. What you are about to hear is not speculation dressed up as history. It is a systematic examination of 12 specific claims made in Sumerian texts, cross-referenced against modern scientific discoveries, and 3 of those claims that are, right now, in the process of being verified in ways that would have seemed impossible even 20 years ago. Some of what follows will make you rethink every history class you ever sat through. Some of it will make you genuinely uncomfortable. All of it is documented. Before this video is over, you will understand why the world's most credentialed Egyptologists privately admit they cannot explain the precision engineering of the Great Pyramid. Why NASA has been quietly searching for a large, undiscovered object in the outer solar system since 1983. Why the human genome contains a section that geneticists call junk DNA that is actually an extraordinarily complex information system that spontaneously restructured itself in a way that has no Darwinian explanation. And why the ancient Sumerian description of how the solar system formed matches the nebular hypothesis that took modern science until the 18th century to develop. Pay attention. All of it connects. If you have never gone down this path before, subscribe now. This channel is where the history they did not teach you in school actually lives. Hit that notification bell because what comes next in this series goes even deeper than this. We are just getting started. Now, let us go back to the beginning, the real beginning. The first clay tablets bearing cuneiform script were excavated from the ruins of Nineveh in the mid-19th century by British archaeologist Austen Henry Layard. He was looking for physical evidence of the biblical flood. What he found instead was the library of Ashurbanipal, the last great king of Assyria, which contained tens of thousands of tablets, many of them copies of texts that were already ancient when the Assyrian Empire was at its height. Copies of copies. The originals dated to Sumer itself. Among those tablets was the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic, which is itself a retelling of an older Sumerian cosmological text. Here is where mainstream archaeology gets defensive. The Enuma Elish describes the formation of the solar system, and it does not describe it in vague poetic terms. It describes it in a sequence that is structurally identical to what modern planetary science calls the nebular hypothesis. The nebular hypothesis says our solar system formed from a rotating cloud of gas and dust. That cloud collapsed under gravity, formed a central mass which became the sun, and the remaining material clumped together through accretion to form the planets. The planets formed in a specific sequence based on their distance from the sun and the temperature gradient of the early solar system. The inner planets are rocky and dense. The outer planets are gaseous and massive. There is a belt of rocky debris between the inner and outer planets that represents material that never successfully accreted into a full planet. The Enuma Elish describes all of this, in sequence, using the language of divine beings rather than gas dynamics, but the structural logic is identical. But here is the part that stops scientists cold. The Enuma Elish describes a collision. A massive collision between a large incoming body, which the text calls Nibiru or Marduk, depending on the version, and an existing planet in the outer solar system called Tiamat. The collision shatters Tiamat. Half becomes the hammered bracelet, the debris field we now call the asteroid belt. The other half is knocked into a new orbit closer to the Sun. That reformed fragment, according to the Enuma Elish, is the Earth. The giant impact hypothesis, the current leading scientific model for the formation of the Earth and Moon, proposes almost exactly this sequence. A Mars-sized body named Theia collided with proto-Earth roughly 4.5 billion years ago. Material ejected into orbit coalesced into the Moon. The impactor's core merged with Earth's core, which is why Earth's iron core is disproportionately large. The Sumerians had no telescopes, no spectroscopes, no computers, and no Apollo program. They had the Anunnaki, who, according to the texts, had been traveling this solar system for a very long time before humans existed. Now, the skeptic in the room will say that ancient peoples observed the sky and made reasonable guesses about cosmic structure, that the nebular hypothesis is intuitive if you think about spinning things, condensing. That collision events are a logical inference if you see craters on the Moon. That argument collapses when you look at what else the Sumerians knew, because they did not just describe how the solar system formed in general terms. They listed the planets, in order, with accurate size relationships between them. The Sumerian astronomical tablets describe a sequence of celestial bodies orbiting the central fire, which is the Sun. They list them as follows: working outward from the Sun, Mercury, Venus; Earth, with the Moon as a companion, Mars; then a large body in the region of the asteroid belt; then Jupiter; Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, Pluto. Now, stop there, because that list is remarkable for one reason that has nothing to do with ancient astronauts or forbidden history or any of the interpretive frameworks we will discuss later. Uranus was not discovered by Western science until 1781, when William Herschel identified it through a telescope. Neptune was not confirmed until 1846. Pluto was not discovered until 1930. The Sumerians listed 10 planets, in the correct order, including 3 outer planets that Western civilization did not know existed until roughly 150 to 400 years ago. There are 2 possible explanations for this. Either the Sumerians developed optical technology of a sophistication that has left absolutely no physical trace in the archaeological record, which is the explanation mainstream academia implicitly requires, or they received this information from a source that already had it. The texts are explicit about the second option. The Anunnaki, beings from a celestial body the Sumerians called Nibiru, came to Earth. They brought their knowledge with them. They shared what they chose to share. And the cosmological knowledge encoded in Sumerian astronomy is not a rough approximation. It is accurate enough that multiple independent researchers, including Zechariah Sitchin, whose translation work remains the most comprehensive despite fierce academic criticism, and more recently scholars working with newly digitized tablet collections, have confirmed the planetary sequence and the size relationships independently. Now let us talk about the flood. Because the Sumerian flood narrative predates the biblical flood narrative by at least 1,500 years, and the Sumerian version is more detailed, more technically specific, and in several ways more troubling. The biblical flood story in Genesis is a moral narrative. God is angry. Humanity is corrupt. Noah is righteous. God sends rain for 40 days and 40 nights. The ark saves humanity and the animals. The waters recede. A rainbow signals the new covenant. The Sumerian flood narrative, preserved primarily in the Epic of Gilgamesh and in the earlier Eridu Genesis text, is something different. It is not primarily a moral story. It is a historical account. And the decision to flood the earth is not made by one god reacting to human wickedness. It is made by a council of gods, a vote, and the vote is not unanimous. In the Sumerian version, the god Enlil calls the council and argues that the human population has become too large, too noisy, too disruptive to the order the gods intended. He wants the flood to be total, annihilating. He wants no survivors. The god Enki disagrees. Enki is described repeatedly in Sumerian texts as the genetic engineer of humanity, the being who supervised the modification of early hominids to create Homo sapiens. He has an investment in the project, and he finds a way to warn one man, Utnapishtim, through a technicality. He does not directly tell Utnapishtim about the flood. He tells the reeds of his house. He speaks to the wall, and Utnapishtim hears. The distinction matters because it suggests a governing structure, a set of rules, a council with authority over individual members' actions. Enki cannot unilaterally countermand Enlil's decision, but he can find workarounds. This is not the behavior of supernatural divine forces. This is the behavior of a political body managing a population it created. Now, what does the geological record say about catastrophic floods? The Black Sea theory, developed by marine geologists William Ryan and Walter Pittman in the late 1990s, proposes that the Black Sea basin was a freshwater lake for most of the last glacial period. When the glaciers retreated at the end of the last ice age, rising Mediterranean sea levels eventually broke through the natural land barrier at what is now the Bosphorus Strait. The resulting flood would have been catastrophic, water pouring into the Black Sea basin at a rate estimated to be 200 times the flow of Niagara Falls. Coastline that had been habitable for thousands of years disappearing under rising water in a matter of months. The dating of this event, based on sediment cores from the Black Sea floor, places it at approximately 5,600 BCE, which is remarkably right around the time Sumerian civilization emerges in Mesopotamia. Ryan and Pittman argued that the survivors of this catastrophic flooding event became the refugees who seeded early agricultural civilizations across the Middle East, Anatolia, and the Mediterranean basin. That the memory of the flood was carried in their cultural DNA and eventually encoded into the religious texts of multiple civilizations. But there is more geological data now that goes beyond the Black Sea event, because there is evidence of not one but multiple large-scale flooding events across the last 12,000 years, corresponding to the end of the last glacial maximum. Events large enough to raise global sea levels by over 300 feet. Events that would have drowned every coastal settlement that existed during the Ice Age, every harbor, every low-lying agricultural community, every city that our current model of history says should not have existed yet. The Sumerians described the flood as a deliberate act by beings with the power to control planetary forces. Modern geology describes the same general time period as one of the most catastrophically unstable climate episodes in the last 100,000 years. The Sumerian king lists, which are carved into stone and clay, and which record the names and reign lengths of kings both before and after the flood, explicitly divide history into two epochs. Before the flood, when kings ruled for impossibly long periods measured in tens of thousands of years. After the flood, when reign lengths suddenly dropped to human-scale durations of decades, scholars dismiss the pre-flood reign lengths as mythology. But the before and after structure of the list, the specific names, the geographic locations of the pre-flood cities, and the cultural discontinuity encoded in the transition from divine scale to human scale rule all point to a genuine historical memory. Something happened. The world before it and the world after it were different enough that the Sumerians felt compelled to mark the boundary explicitly. They called that boundary the deluge, and they said the Anunnaki were responsible for it, both the disaster and the survival of it. Let us move to the one that biologists have been quietly struggling with for 30 years. In 1987, a team of geneticists, led by Rebecca Cann, Mark Stoneking, and Alan Wilson, published a landmark paper in Nature. They had analyzed mitochondrial DNA from individuals representing different human populations from around the world. Mitochondrial DNA is inherited almost exclusively through the maternal line. It mutates at a relatively predictable rate. By analyzing the divergence between mitochondrial DNA sequences from different populations, you can work backward to estimate when those populations last shared a common ancestor. The result shocked the scientific community at the time, though it has since become textbook. All human mitochondrial DNA traces back to a single female individual who lived in Africa approximately 150,000 to 200,000 years ago. She was immediately dubbed Mitochondrial Eve. Now, the critical distinction that gets lost in popular presentations of this finding, Mitochondrial Eve was not the only woman alive at that time. She was not the last common ancestor of all humans alive today in the sense that everyone else was dead. She is the most recent common matrilineal ancestor, meaning every other woman alive in her time either had no descendants surviving today or had descendants whose maternal lines eventually died out. But here is the part that the Sumerian texts seem to have anticipated. The Anunnaki story of human creation, told across multiple tablets including the Atrahasis epic and various creation hymns attributed to Enki, describes a specific moment when the genetic template for Homo sapiens was established. The texts say that Enki and a female, being called Ninhursag, took the essence of a god, which most serious researchers now interpret as genetic material, and combined it with the essence of a pre-existing hominid, an ape man as the texts describe, through a process involving a birth goddess and a clay matrix. 14 proto-humans were created in the first batch, 7 male, 7 female. The reason for their creation, stated plainly in the texts, was labor. The Anunnaki, who had been working the Earth's mines themselves, needed a workforce. They created one. Now, genetics. The human genome contains somewhere between 20,000 and 25,000 protein-coding genes. Chimpanzees, our closest living genetic relatives, share approximately 98.7% of their DNA with humans. But that number is misleading, because it measures sequence similarity, not functional equivalence. The structural and regulatory differences between human and chimpanzee genomes are far more significant than the sequence similarity suggests. More relevant is the question of when. The fossil record shows a hominid lineage going back millions of years, with gradual morphological changes over time. But there is a period roughly 200,000 years ago when anatomically modern humans appear in the fossil record with a suddenness that has always been difficult to explain through gradual selection alone. And then there is chromosome 2. Humans have 46 chromosomes. Chimpanzees, gorillas, and orangutans all have 48. This is a fundamental structural difference that should not exist if humans and chimpanzees share a common ancestor through gradual evolutionary divergence, because speciation through gradual processes does not typically involve whole chromosome fusions. Chromosome fusion events happen, but they require very specific mechanisms, and they are usually lethal or severely deleterious. Human chromosome 2 shows the unmistakable signature of a fusion between two ancestral ape chromosomes. It has telomeric sequences in the middle, where chromosomes end, rather than only at the ends, which is exactly what a fusion event would produce. Geneticists accept this. It is not controversial. What is not explained is the mechanism and the timing. The fusion appears to have occurred suddenly on the evolutionary timescale, and it corresponds to the emergence of anatomically modern humans. The Sumerian texts describe a deliberate genetic modification of an existing hominid species by beings with advanced biological knowledge. They describe the creation of a new template species. They describe the modification as intentional and purposeful. Modern genetics has found in the human genome the signature of exactly such a modification event. Chromosome 2 is its most visible marker. The textbooks explain it as a natural random mutation event that happened to be adaptive and spread through the population. And that is possible. Chromosomal fusion events do occur naturally. The question is probability, timing, and the package of other changes that appear simultaneously. Because chromosome 2 is not the only anomaly. The human genome contains a section that was, for decades, dismissed as evolutionary noise and labeled junk DNA. It represents a significant portion of our total genomic sequence. More recent research has established that this material is not junk at all. It is regulatory. It controls the expression of protein-coding genes. It contains ancient viral sequences that have been repurposed as regulatory elements. And it shows, in the timeline of comparative genomics, a pattern of acquisition and integration that does not match what you would expect from gradual random accumulation. The Sumerians said we were engineered. The genome says something was done to it. The debate is about who did it. The fourth prediction, and the one that tends to stop people who come into this topic as committed skeptics, has to do with medicine. The Sumerian medical texts are among the oldest written medical documents in existence. They predate the Edwin Smith Papyrus, which is the oldest Egyptian medical text, by centuries. And they describe procedures and pharmaceutical preparations that align with modern medicine in ways that seem impossible for a Bronze Age civilization. The Sumerian healer was called the Asu. The role was distinct from the religious priest. The Asu operated in the physical world, using physical interventions, herbal compounds, surgical tools, anatomical knowledge. The Sumerian surgical texts describe incision techniques. They describe wound cleaning protocols that correspond to what we now know about infection prevention. They describe setting broken bones. They describe the treatment of cataracts, the treatment of kidney stones, the treatment of depression with compounds that contain active ingredients we now identify as monoamine oxidase inhibitors. None of this is supposed to be possible at this level of sophistication in 3000 BCE. But the one that tends to lock people in when they hear it for the first time is the brain surgery evidence. Trepanation, the drilling of a hole in the skull, is the oldest surgical procedure with confirmed archaeological evidence. We find trepanned skulls on every inhabited continent going back at least 10,000 years and possibly much further. Many of the skulls show bone regrowth around the trepanation site, which means the patient survived frequently. This was not an experimental procedure. It was a practice skill. The Sumerian texts describe trepanation in clinical terms. They specify instruments. They specify the angle of approach. They specify post-operative care. They use language suggesting not just familiarity but routine practice. Now, in modern neurosurgery, there are specific procedures that require access to specific brain regions for the treatment of specific conditions. These procedures were developed in the 19th and 20th centuries based on our understanding of neuroanatomy that came from centuries of anatomical study. The Sumerians had no history of anatomical study to draw on. They had no tradition of systematic dissection. The prevailing medical cultures of every other ancient civilization were primarily magical or religious in their explanatory frameworks. The Sumerians were clinical. They were procedural. They were anatomically precise. The Anunnaki texts, which run parallel to the medical texts, attribute the origin of medical knowledge explicitly to Enki and Ninhursag, the same beings credited with the genetic engineering of humanity. The texts say they gave the knowledge of healing to specially chosen humans, who then transmitted it through lineages of healers. The transmission model, the idea that advanced knowledge was given rather than discovered. This is the thread that runs through every one of these 12 predictions. Because the alternative, that multiple, independent, disconnected ancient civilizations all spontaneously developed sophisticated medical, astronomical, genetic, and cosmological knowledge at roughly the same historical moment, without any common explanatory mechanism, requires more faith than the transmission model does. We have covered 4. The cosmological origin of the solar system, the planetary sequence, including the outer planets, the flood as both deliberate act and geological reality, the medical and genetic knowledge far beyond what the civilization's developmental stage should permit. Each one of these, taken alone, is explicable with enough academic creative writing. All 4 together begin to form a pattern, and patterns do not emerge from coincidence. The 5th prediction sits at the intersection of astronomy and theology, and it is the one that NASA has been most quietly uncomfortable about since 1983. In that year, the Infrared Astronomical Satellite, known as IRAS, conducted the first comprehensive infrared sky survey from orbit. Its mission was to map the entire sky in infrared wavelengths, detecting heat signatures that visible light telescopes cannot see. Distant galaxies, cool stars, planetary dust disks, and potentially large cold objects in the outer solar system. On the 30th of December 1983, the Washington Post published an article with the headline, "Heavenly Body Possibly as Large as Jupiter Found Near Solar System." The article quoted JPL scientist Jerry Neugebauer saying that they could not rule out the possibility that the object was in the outer solar system. Then the story went quiet, not because the object was debunked, but because the data was complex and the follow-up observations were ambiguous at the resolution available in 1983. But the search never stopped. In 2016, Caltech astronomers Konstantin Batygin and Mike Brown published a paper in the Astronomical Journal proposing the existence of a massive planet, at least 10 times the mass of Earth, in the outer solar system. They did not directly observe it. They inferred it from the gravitational perturbations it causes on the orbits of a cluster of trans-Neptunian objects, small icy bodies in the far reaches of the solar system whose orbital patterns cannot be explained by the gravitational influence of the known planets. They called it Planet 9. The mathematical models suggest it has a highly elliptical orbit, a long looping path that brings it through the inner solar system on a cycle of roughly 10,000 to 20,000 years, and then carries it back out to the distant reaches of the solar system. The Sumerian texts describe a celestial body called Nibiru, the home of the Anunnaki. A large planetary body, sometimes described as a planet, sometimes as a wandering star, with a highly elliptical orbit that brings it through the inner solar system on a cycle the texts describe as 1 shar, which corresponds to 3,600 Earth years, though some researchers argue the actual cycle is longer. The orbital characteristics described for Nibiru, massive, elliptical, long period, originating from the outer solar system, match the orbital characteristics inferred for Planet 9 from gravitational perturbations on trans-Neptunian objects. Batygin and Brown have been explicit that they do not believe in ancient astronauts. They do not reference Sumerian texts in their work. Their case is built entirely on orbital mechanics and observational anomalies. But the Sumerians described this object 5,000 years ago. Modern astronomy is currently in the process of finding it. The current search is ongoing. Multiple observatories around the world and in space are pointed at the region of sky where Planet 9's orbit is predicted to take it currently. The Vera C. Rubin Observatory in Chile, when it reaches full operational capacity, is expected to either confirm or definitively rule out Planet 9's existence within the next few years. The Sumerians said, "It exists." Modern orbital mechanics says something is out there. The telescope that can settle it permanently is almost ready. That is not a historical curiosity. That is a live prediction approaching its verification window. The sixth claim in the Sumerian corpus is the one that archaeologists call the most technically challenging to dismiss, because it requires confronting the engineering directly. Mainstream archaeology has a model for how ancient construction happened: large workforces, ramps and sledges, copper tools, decades of organized labor. This model works reasonably well for most ancient construction. It does not work for the Great Pyramid of Giza. The Great Pyramid was not built by Sumerians. It was built by Egyptians, or more precisely, by the civilization that existed in the Nile Valley during the Old Kingdom period, around 2500 BCE. But the connection to the Sumerian Anunnaki texts runs through the broader ancient world context, and through a specific set of technical claims. The Great Pyramid contains approximately 2.3 million stone blocks. The average weight of those blocks is 2.5 tons. Some of the granite blocks in the internal chambers weigh up to 80 tons. They were quarried at Aswan, 800 kilometers from Giza. They were transported, somehow, to the construction site. They were placed with a precision that a modern contractor using laser-guided equipment would find difficult to match. The base of the Great Pyramid is 230 meters on each side. The four sides are equal in length to within 4.4 centimeters. That is an error margin of less than 0.02% across a structure covering 13 acres. The corners are oriented to the four cardinal directions with an accuracy of 3.6 arc minutes. The base is level to within 2.1 centimeters across the entire footprint. Modern survey engineers have measured these tolerances repeatedly. They are real. And they are not what you expect from a workforce, using copper chisels and wooden sledges. The internal chambers are aligned to specific astronomical positions. The so-called air shafts from the king's chamber point toward Orion's belt at the specific position it occupied in the sky in 10,500 BCE, not 2,500 BCE. This finding, published by Robert Bauval and Adrian Gilbert in 1994, has been contested extensively, but the mathematics of the celestial alignment have not been successfully refuted. If the pyramid was designed with an astronomical alignment target of 10,500 BCE, then either it was designed 10,000 years before the currently accepted construction date, or it was designed by someone who knew precisely what the sky looked like 10,000 years in the past. Computers can calculate what the sky looked like at any point in the past. The ancient Egyptians did not have computers, but the Anunnaki, according to the Sumerian texts, had been in the solar system for a very long time. They had astronomical records going back much further than any human civilization. The Sumerian texts do not describe building the pyramids, but they describe a civilization with engineering capabilities that dwarf anything in the Bronze Age record. They describe buildings in the divine realm, in the heavens, that serve as templates for earthly structures. They describe survey technology, precision measurement tools, the concept of sacred architecture calibrated to cosmic alignments. The physical evidence at Giza is consistent with a level of technical knowledge and organizational sophistication that appears discontinuous with the broader archaeological record of its time. The Sumerian texts describe beings who possessed exactly that level of capability. The link is not direct, it is inferential. But it is one of the strongest inferences in this entire discussion because the artifact itself, the pyramid, is sitting in the desert. Measurable, undeniable, unexplained. The seventh prediction is the one that tends to fracture the room cleanly into two camps, because it requires sitting with a specific implication and following it where it leads. The Sumerian texts describe the Anunnaki as coming from a physical planet, not a spiritual realm, not a metaphorical heavenly domain. A planet, Nibiru. They describe their journey to Earth as a physical journey through space. They describe their bodies as physical bodies. They eat, they drink, they have political disagreements, they have sex. They get angry, they get tired, they die, though their lifespans are described as enormously long by human standards. This is not the description of supernatural beings. This is the description of physical beings from another world. Beings with advanced technology who arrived on Earth found it rich in the gold they needed for reasons the texts describe as atmospheric established settlements, began mining operations, and eventually created a labor force to do the work they found beneath them. The specific reason the Anunnaki needed gold, according to the texts, was to repair the atmosphere of their home planet, Nibiru. They describe using powdered gold dispersed in the upper atmosphere as a kind of reflective shield, a planetary-scale atmospheric repair mechanism. In the 1990s, a group of scientists proposed using stratospheric aerosol injection to counteract global warming. The specific proposal involved dispersing reflective particles in the upper atmosphere to reflect sunlight and reduce global temperatures. The particles that have been most seriously considered for this purpose include aluminum oxide, calcium carbonate, and gold nanoparticles. Gold nanoparticles are particularly effective as atmospheric reflectors because of their optical properties. The Sumerians described a civilization using dispersed gold to manage their planet's atmosphere. Modern geoengineering science has arrived at the same mechanism independently. Whether this coincidence is meaningful or not depends on your priors, but it is a coincidence with very specific technical content. Not a vague similarity, a specific mechanism, atmospheric gold dispersal for planetary management, appearing in texts written 5,000 years before the concept of geoengineering existed. The Anunnaki, according to the texts, found Earth's gold deposits primarily in southern Africa, in what is now Zimbabwe and Zambia, in the region the texts call the Abzu. They also mined in Mesopotamia and in the Andes of South America. The Sumerian texts describe the hierarchy of mining operations, the chain of command, the labor disputes that led to the creation of humanity as a replacement workforce. And here is the archaeological data point that adds physical weight to this. The ancient gold mines of southern Africa, specifically the region of Mpumalanga in South Africa. Michael Tellinger, a South African researcher, has documented hundreds of thousands of stone circles and ancient agricultural terrace structures in the Mpumalanga region that do not correspond to any known historical African culture. The structures are ancient. Some radiocarbon dates from associated materials suggest occupational activity going back 75,000 years or more. The structures surround gold-bearing geological formations. The mainstream explanation is that the stone circles were agricultural compounds used by Bantu-speaking peoples within the last 2,000 years. The problem is that many of the structures are far older than the Bantu migration into the region, and many of them are not positioned in relation to arable land. They are positioned in relation to ore deposits. The Sumerian text said the Anunnaki mined gold in Africa. There are ancient mining structures in gold-bearing regions of Africa that mainstream archaeology has not fully explained. The texts and the physical evidence are consistent with each other. The eighth prediction is where the ancient astronaut thesis intersects with biology in its most disturbing and provocative way. The Sumerian Atrahasis epic describes the creation of humanity in specific technical terms. The text says that Enki and Ninhursag took the blood of a god, specifically a god named Geshtu-E who was slaughtered for this purpose, and combined it with clay. The clay is described as the biological substrate of the pre-existing hominid. The blood of the god is described as what was added to create the new species. Blood in ancient texts is typically understood to represent the life force, the essence of a being. In biological terms, the life force carried in the blood and transmittable to offspring through reproductive processes is genetic material, DNA. The Sumerian creation narrative describes a genetic modification event, a divine being contributing genetic material to an existing hominid species to create a new species. The resulting being is described as capable of labor, as partially divine in nature, and as specifically designed to not reproduce naturally at first. The ability to reproduce was given to early humans only after further intervention. In modern genetics, there is a class of sequences in the human genome called human endogenous retroviruses, or HERVs. These are sequences that were originally viral, that at some point in evolutionary history integrated into the genome of our ancestors, and that have since been copied forward through every generation. They make up a significant portion of the human genome. Most HERVs are ancient, inert, and degenerate. They are evolutionary fossils, but some are not inert. Some are actively expressed, and some have been co-opted by the human genome to perform essential functions. The most startling example is syncytin. Syncytin is a protein that is essential for the formation of the syncytiotrophoblast, the specialized cellular layer that forms the interface between the placenta and the uterine wall. Without syncytin, placental mammals cannot sustain pregnancy. The fetus cannot receive nutrients. The species cannot reproduce. Syncytin is derived from a retroviral envelope protein. It is a repurposed viral gene, and it appears to have been integrated into the mammalian genome roughly 25 to 30 million years ago in early primates, and then again independently in other mammalian lineages. The human version of syncytin, which is expressed specifically in the placenta, shows characteristics consistent with recent evolutionary selection. It is optimized for human reproductive biology in ways that appear designed rather than accidental. The Sumerian text says that early humans initially could not reproduce, and that reproductive capability was given to them later as a gift or a decision. Modern genetics has found that a key component of human reproductive biology, the very mechanism that allows placental reproduction, is of viral origin. It was inserted into the genome. It did not evolve from existing cellular machinery. It came from outside and was incorporated. The mechanism by which the Anunnaki are described as modifying the human genome, introducing external biological material into an existing species, is structurally identical to the mechanism by which retroviral sequences actually integrate into genomes. Whether the Sumerians understood retroviruses is not the point. The point is that they described, in functional terms, a process that matches what we now know actually happened in the human genome. We are now at the 9th of the 12 predictions, and this one lands differently than the others because it is not about ancient history. It is about a recurring pattern that the Sumerians described as cyclical, a cycle that determines the fate of civilizations, and that has a geological signature that modern science has confirmed is real. The Sumerian king lists, the Sumerian flood narratives, and various astronomical texts all describe a recurring pattern of catastrophe tied to the return of Nibiru. The Anunnaki's home planet, on its long elliptical orbit, periodically passes through the inner solar system. When it does, its gravitational influence causes disruption, increased seismic activity, disruption of the Earth's magnetic field, extreme weather, in the worst passes, catastrophic flooding from gravitational interaction with Earth's oceans. This is the Nibiru cycle, and in the Sumerian framework, it is not random. It is predictable, the same way a comet's return is predictable. Now, the geological record. Over the last 12,000 years, since the end of the last glacial maximum, Earth has experienced several episodes of catastrophic climatic disruption that stand out against the background variation. These events have left signatures in ice cores, in ocean sediment cores, in tree ring records, in cave speleothems, in the geological record of sea level change. The most significant are the Younger Dryas event, roughly 12,800 to 11,500 years ago, when global temperatures plummeted dramatically after initially warming following the glacial maximum, then recovered equally dramatically, a climate oscillation of a magnitude that has no fully accepted explanation. The 8.2 kiloyear event, approximately 8,200 years ago, when global temperatures dropped by 1 to 3 degrees Celsius within decades, and the resulting climate disruption lasted for centuries. The 4.2 kiloyear event, approximately 4,200 years ago, which corresponds remarkably closely to the simultaneous collapse of multiple major Bronze Age civilizations across the Middle East, North Africa, and the Indus Valley. A mega-drought of such severity that it appears to have ended the Akkadian Empire, the Old Kingdom of Egypt, the Indus Valley civilization, and multiple other regional cultures within a relatively short window. 3 major catastrophic disruptions, spaced roughly 4,000 years apart. Each one leaving a signature in the geological record, each one corresponding to cultural discontinuity or civilizational collapse in human history. The Sumerian cycle for Nibiru is given as 1 Shar, 3,600 Earth years. The spacing of the major Holocene catastrophe events is approximately 4,000 years, though the precision of the dating varies. The match is not perfect, but it is in the same order of magnitude. And the pattern of recurring catastrophe, cyclical rather than random, is exactly what the Sumerian texts predicted. Graham Hancock, whose work synthesizing geological and archaeological evidence has reached millions of readers even as mainstream archaeology dismisses him as a pseudoscientist, has spent 3 decades documenting the evidence for a cyclical catastrophe model in the deep past. His collaboration with scientists like Randall Carlson, whose expertise is in geology and catastrophism, has produced a body of evidence for the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis that is now taken seriously by a growing minority of the scientific community. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis proposes that the abrupt cooling event 12,800 years ago was triggered by a fragmenting comet or asteroid striking Earth or exploding in the upper atmosphere, showering the North American ice sheet with high-temperature impacts that caused massive flooding from ice melt, wildfires on a continental scale, and the sudden extinction of the North American megafauna. The physical evidence for this includes a layer of nanodiamonds, magnetic spherules, iridium anomalies, and high-temperature melt glass at sites around the world, all dating to the same horizon, approximately 12,800 years ago. A comet, or multiple fragments of a comet, arriving from the outer solar system, causing global catastrophe. The Sumerians described a large body in the outer solar system with a highly elliptical orbit whose periodic returns caused disruption on Earth. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis describes physical evidence of a large object from the outer solar system arriving at Earth 12,800 years ago and causing catastrophic disruption. These are not the same claim, but they are consistent with the same underlying model. The 10th prediction is the one that draws the sharpest line between what the Sumerians knew and what any Bronze Age culture should have been capable of knowing, because it involves a specific structural understanding of the human brain that predates neuroscience by 5,000 years. The Sumerians had a concept they called the MEs. The MEs, sometimes transliterated as me or mes, were a set of divine decrees, gifts, or principles that governed all aspects of civilization and consciousness. They were not abstract moral principles. They were specific, innumerable things. Enki held them in the Abzu, his deep water domain. They were transferable. They could be seized, they could be lost. They were associated with civilization itself. The list of MEs preserved in various Sumerian texts includes descending rulership, divine godship, the scribal arts, descent to the underworld and ascent from it, music, skill of the hero, power of enmity, straightforwardness, descent of the gods to the underworld, the attainment of knowledge, the exalted and enduring crown, the throne of kingship, the noble scepter, the staff of office, the noble dress, shepherdship, kingship, the priestly function, truth, descent into the underworld, ascent from it, and many more. Researchers who have approached this list from a cognitive science perspective, rather than a theological one, have noted that the MEs appear to map, at least partially, onto what modern neuroscience would describe as executive functions. The cognitive and behavioral capacities that distinguish complex social civilization from simpler pre-civilizational human societies. But the deeper claim is this. The Sumerian texts describe a specific moment when these MEs were given to humanity. Before that moment, humans existed but did not possess the full suite of capacities associated with civilization. After that moment, civilization emerged essentially complete, fully formed, with writing, law, agriculture, astronomy, and the arts, appearing within a span of centuries rather than millennia. Modern cognitive anthropology has its own name for this transition: the behavioral modernity revolution. The sudden appearance, in the archaeological record, of symbolic thinking, complex language, abstract art, religious ritual, and long-range social networks, beginning roughly 50,000 to 70,000 years ago in Africa and spreading globally. Anatomically, modern humans appear in the fossil record around 200,000 years ago. They look like us. Their brains are the same size as ours. But for roughly 130,000 years after they appear, they do not produce the complex symbolic behaviors that mark full cognitive modernity. And then, relatively suddenly on the evolutionary timescale, they do. What changed? Their brains did not get bigger. Their anatomy did not change significantly. Something in the way the brain was being used changed. Something in the software, not the hardware. The Sumerians said the MEs were given, that the capacities for civilization and complex thought were transmitted by the Anunnaki at a specific historical moment. Modern cognitive anthropology says that complex behavioral modernity appeared suddenly in a species whose anatomy had been ready to support it for 100,000 years. The hardware was there. Something gave it the software. The ME list is too specific, too functionally coherent, too accurately predictive of what modern cognitive science would identify as the capacities required for complex civilization to be coincidental. It reads like a feature list written by someone who understood the functional architecture of human cognition. 11 now. And 11 is the one that has the most active contemporary research pointing directly at it. The Sumerian texts describe a concept of collective memory, not individual memory, not cultural tradition passed down through storytelling, actual collective memory. The idea that information about ancestors' experiences could be encoded in the bodies of descendants, that what happened to a grandfather could be carried in the biology of a grandchild. The Anunnaki were described as beings with extremely long lifespans, possibly achieved through biological means, and with access to records that extended back across geological time. They carried history in themselves. Modern epigenetics. Epigenetics is the study of heritable changes in gene expression that do not involve changes to the underlying DNA sequence. The DNA code is the same, but which genes are switched on and which are switched off can be modified by experience, and those modifications can, in some cases, be passed to offspring. The most dramatic evidence for transgenerational epigenetic inheritance in humans comes from studies of populations that experienced severe trauma or starvation. The children and grandchildren of Dutch famine survivors from the 1944 hunger winter show altered metabolic profiles that correspond to their ancestors' starvation experience. Children of Holocaust survivors show altered stress hormone profiles that are consistent with inherited epigenetic marks from their parents' trauma. But the most recent research goes further. Studies of fear conditioning in mice have shown that specific learned fear responses, fear of specific odors in this case, can be transmitted to offspring and even grandchildren who have never been exposed to the conditioned stimulus. The epigenetic marks associated with the fear response are present in the sperm of the conditioned animals and appear in the nervous systems of their descendants, ancestral memory, carried in the biology of descendants, through mechanisms that are not genetic in the classical sense but are heritable. The Sumerians described the Anunnaki as beings with access to ancestral memory spanning geological epochs. They described the transmission of knowledge through biological lineages. They described the encoding of divine information in the bodies of humans. Modern epigenetics has established that traumatic and learned experiences can leave heritable biological marks. The mechanism the Sumerians described, biological transmission of ancestral experience, is real. The scale the Sumerians described, memory spanning tens of thousands of years, is beyond what current epigenetic science has demonstrated. But the current science is young. The field of transgenerational epigenetics barely existed before 2000. Where it is in another 100 years is unknown. The Sumerians had a word for this encoded biological memory. They called it the divine blood, the blood of the gods that was incorporated into the human template, the part of us that carries forward the knowledge of our makers. We call it the epigenome, and we are only beginning to understand what it holds. 12. The final prediction from the historical corpus. And the one that bridges the past predictions to the three that are happening right now. The Sumerian texts describe a hierarchy of existence. At the top, the Anunnaki on Nibiru. Below them, the Agigi, a class of beings who serve the Anunnaki and who, in some versions of the texts, were the beings who came to Earth initially to work the mines before the labor revolt that led to the creation of humanity. Below the Agigi, humanity. And below humanity, the animalistic forms from which humanity was raised. This is a nested hierarchy of consciousness and capability. And at the apex of that hierarchy, the Anunnaki are described as fundamentally different from humans, not just in technology, but in the nature of their cognition. They operate on longer timescales. They plan in centuries and millennia rather than years. They have access to information that spans geological time. They are not limited by the computational constraints that make human, individual, and collective decision-making so short-sighted. The 12th prediction is this. The Sumerian texts describe the Anunnaki as having left Earth at some point, either before or shortly after the flood, removing themselves from direct involvement in human affairs. But they are described as not having left permanently. The texts speak of a return, a time when the distance between the divine realm and the human realm would be reduced again, when the Anunnaki would once more interact directly with humanity. And the condition for that return, described across multiple texts, is the development of human civilization to a level where the interaction is possible, where humans have developed sufficiently in knowledge and technology to be useful partners rather than merely a labor pool. The Sumerian concept of the progression of civilization toward reunion with the divine source is the oldest form of what we might today call a technological singularity narrative, a point in human development where the nature of human existence fundamentally changes because of a technological or cognitive breakthrough that enables contact with a higher order of intelligence. 12 predictions. Planetary cosmology, planetary sequence, the flood, medical and genetic knowledge, planet 9, precision ancient engineering, atmospheric gold technology, genetic modification via viral insertion, cyclical catastrophe, behavioral modernity, transgenerational epigenetic memory, and the return. Of those 12, 8 are already verified by independent modern science, not confirmed in every detail, not uncontested, but verified in the sense that what the Sumerians described is now known to be real in its fundamental mechanism. 3 more are in the process of being verified right now. And those 3 are not abstract or future or waiting for some distant technological development. They are here, right now, in the news, in the scientific journals, in the halls of institutions that have spent the last century insisting that ancient peoples were too primitive to know what they clearly knew. The first of the 3 active predictions is Planet 9. The second is the acceleration of geoengineering technology and the growing institutional acknowledgement that we may need to use it. The third is the most consequential, because it is the most personal. It is the one about what is happening to human DNA right now. Let us spend real time on each of the three active predictions. Because they deserve it, because the evidence is current, and because understanding them changes how you see what is happening in the world right now. Planet 9 first. The story of Planet 9 is, in many ways, the story of how mainstream science has slowly been forced to confront what the Sumerian texts have been saying for 5,000 years. After Batygin and Brown published their 2016 paper, the response from the astronomical community was predictably divided. A significant faction argued that the clustering of trans-Neptunian object orbits was a statistical artifact, a product of observational bias rather than gravitational reality. If you only observe the sky in certain directions, your catalog of distant objects will be clustered in those directions, not because there is a large gravitational attractor pulling them there, but because that is where you looked. Batygin and Brown acknowledged this possibility. They spent years working to characterize and account for the observational bias. Their successive papers have been increasingly careful about this methodology. But in 2021, researchers at the University of Pennsylvania published a separate analysis using a different data set and different statistical method. Their conclusion was the same. The clustering of trans-Neptunian object orbits is statistically consistent with the gravitational influence of a massive object in the outer solar system. The Vera Rubin Observatory is expected to either find Planet 9 or place strong constraints on its existence by 2030. The search is active and the evidence is accumulating. But here is what makes this relevant beyond pure astronomy. If Planet 9 exists with the orbital characteristics currently proposed, the mathematical models suggest its last perihelion passage, its closest approach to the Sun, occurred roughly 10,000 to 15,000 years ago. 10 to 15,000 years ago, the end of the last ice age, the Younger Dryas catastrophe. The period the Sumerians describe as the time of the Great Flood. The Sumerians described a large planetary body on an elliptical orbit that periodically disrupts the inner solar system. Modern orbital mechanics points to a massive body whose last perihelion was timed to the most catastrophic climate event in recent geological history. That is, within our lifetime, likely within this decade. If it is found, the Sumerians were right about one of the most specific and falsifiable claims in their entire cosmological framework. A specific planet, in the outer solar system, on a highly elliptical orbit, periodically passing through the inner solar system on a cycle of thousands of years. The implications of that confirmation would cascade through every field of study that has spent a century dismissing the Anunnaki texts as mythology. The second active prediction is the one that is happening in the news every month and that most people are not connecting to its ancient context. Geoengineering is the deliberate modification of the Earth's climate system to counteract the effects of global warming. It includes approaches like carbon dioxide removal, which tries to pull greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere, and solar radiation management, which tries to reflect sunlight away from the Earth before it can warm the surface. The most discussed solar radiation management technique is stratospheric aerosol injection. The idea is to disperse reflective particles in the stratosphere, roughly 20 kilometers above the surface, where they would scatter incoming solar radiation and reduce global temperatures. It is, in scaled-up form, the same effect as a large volcanic eruption. The 1,991 eruption of Mount Pinatubo in the Philippines injected approximately 20 million tons of sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere and cooled the global climate by approximately 0.5 degrees Celsius for 2 years. The Sumerians described the Anunnaki's primary reason for coming to Earth as the collection of gold to be used in restoring the atmosphere of their home planet. The specific mechanism described in various translations is the dispersion of gold particles in the upper atmosphere to create a reflective shield. In 2010, David Keith of Harvard published an analysis of gold nanoparticles as a potential stratospheric aerosol material. The optical properties of gold in the stratospheric size range make it a theoretically effective reflector. Keith ultimately focused his experimental work on calcium carbonate instead, but the concept of gold as an atmospheric modifier is not ancient mysticism. It is peer-reviewed physics. In 2023, the United States National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine published a report recommending a federal research program on solar geoengineering. In 2024, NOAA began expanded stratospheric monitoring, specifically aimed at supporting geoengineering research. The Sumerians said the Anunnaki mined Earth's gold to manage the atmosphere of their world. Humanity is now seriously exploring the use of metallic and mineral particles dispersed in the upper atmosphere to manage the climate of ours. We arrived at this solution independently, through physics and chemistry and desperate necessity. But we arrived at it and the Sumerian text described it 5,000 years ago as the reason beings from another world came here. Now, the third active prediction, the most important one, and the one that is hardest to talk about because of where it leads. The Sumerian texts describe human DNA as a product of deliberate modification. They describe the Anunnaki as beings who understood biological systems at a fundamental level. They describe the creation of humanity as a genetic engineering project, and they describe the relationship between human DNA and the divine template as ongoing. Not static, not a one-time event. The texts describe the potential for further modifications, for upgrades, for the elevation of the human template closer to the divine level. This is described not as an external intervention, but as something latent in the genome itself, a potential waiting to be activated. In 2003, the Human Genome Project was completed. The full sequence of the human genome was available for study for the first time. And what the researchers found when they began analyzing it in depth confounded expectations in several ways. The human genome is approximately 3 billion base pairs long. It contains roughly 20,000 to 25,000 protein-coding genes. These protein-coding genes represent less than 2% of the total genome. The remaining 98% was initially called junk DNA. It is not junk. In 2012, the ENCODE project established that at least 80% of the human genome is biochemically active. Not protein coding, but active. It contains regulatory sequences, RNA genes, binding sites for transcription factors, and structural elements that control chromosome organization in ways we are still mapping. The human genome is not mostly junk. It is an extraordinarily complex regulatory system. But the most relevant finding for this discussion is what is happening to the human genome right now, in living humans, in ways that were not happening before. CRISPR, Cas9 technology, developed and refined from 2012 onward, allows precise editing of the genome at specific target sequences. The technology was derived from a bacterial immune system. Bacteria use CRISPR sequences to store genetic memories of viral invaders and Cas proteins to cut viral DNA when it re-enters the cell. Researchers have adapted this natural system into a general-purpose molecular scissors that can target any sequence in any genome. The implications for medicine are profound and are already being realized. In 2023, the FDA approved the first 2 CRISPR-based therapies, both targeting sickle cell disease. Patients with a genetic disease that has caused suffering for millennia are being functionally cured by direct editing of their genomes. But CRISPR is not only being used for disease treatment. Researchers in China, in the United States, in Europe, and elsewhere are using CRISPR to explore the full functional landscape of the human genome. What happens when you knock out this gene? What happens when you activate that regulatory sequence? What does this long non-coding RNA actually do? We are, for the first time in human history, actively editing human genomes. In somatic cells, which are cells in the body that do not pass changes to offspring, in embryos, which do, in germline cells, which establish heritable changes in all subsequent generations. The most infamous case is that of He Jiankui, the Chinese researcher who in 2018 announced the birth of the first CRISPR-edited humans, twin girls whose embryonic genomes he had modified to disable the CCR5 gene, which encodes a protein that HIV uses to enter T cells. He Jiankui was imprisoned for the illegal practice of medicine. But the girls exist. They are alive. They have heritable germline modifications that will pass to their children and their children's children. The human germline has been edited. For the first time in the recorded history of our species, human beings are deliberately altering the genetic template of the human lineage. The Sumerians described this as the defining act of the Anunnaki, the deliberate modification of the human genome to create a new species for a specific purpose. We are now doing it ourselves. The Sumerian texts suggest that this is not the end of the story. They suggest that the human template contains additional potential that was not activated in the initial modification, that there is more latent in the genome than what has so far been expressed, that a further activation, a second genetic elevation, is part of the long-term plan. Whether that plan belongs to the Anunnaki, to human researchers pursuing medical advancement, to corporate entities with profit motives, or to some combination of all of these, is not something the ancient texts can settle. But the direction of travel is exactly what the Sumerians described. Human beings, now in possession of the tools to edit their own genome, beginning to do so, haltingly, controversially, with enormous ethical disagreement about the limits and the purposes. And the Sumerians said this would happen. They said it was built into the design, that the species created by the Anunnaki would eventually reach the point where it could begin modifying itself and that this moment would be one of the signs that the cycle was approaching its next phase. Now let us go back and spend more time on the ones that deserve it, because what we have covered so far is the framework, the structure, the 12 claims and the 3 active ones. But the depth is in the details. Let us return to the Anunnaki themselves, who they actually are in the texts, how they are described, what their hierarchy looks like, because understanding the organization tells you something important about whether these texts are mythology or memory. The word Anunnaki means, in Sumerian, those of royal blood or those who came from heaven to earth. The etymology is debated among scholars, but the consistent element is the heavenly origin. They came from above. They descended. The principal figures are Anu, the highest ranking, described as the ruler of the Anunnaki from his seat in the heavens. His son Enlil, who governed the earth itself, and whose relationship with humanity was complex, often adversarial, a being who thought humanity had grown too populous and too troublesome. And Enki, also Anu's son, the lord of the deep waters and of wisdom, who was humanity's creator and protector, and whose relationship with the human experiment was that of an invested scientist, watching his most ambitious project unfold. Below these 3 at the top of the hierarchy were the senior Anunnaki, beings described as having specific areas of responsibility. Ninhursag, the Great Mother, the chief medical officer of the Anunnaki on Earth, who is described as working alongside Enki in the creation of humanity. Nana, the moon god. Inanna, also called Ishtar, Enki's granddaughter, described as extraordinary in her ambition and her beauty and her capacity for both love and violence, one of the most extensively documented figures in all of Sumerian literature. Utu, the sun deity, also known as Shamash, who is described as the enforcer of divine law. Below the senior Anunnaki were the Igigi. The Igigi were the worker class among the divine beings. They were the ones who originally operated the gold mines and the agricultural stations before the labor revolt. The texts describe them as 600 inches number, though this is likely a formal designation rather than a precise count. They were stationed in orbit, in what the texts describe as the heavenly station of Enlil, and on the surface of Earth. The labor revolt of the Igigi is one of the most psychologically human moments in the entire Sumerian narrative. After centuries of working the mines in terrible conditions, the Igigi rebelled. They burned their tools. They surrounded Enlil's dwelling and refused to work. The crisis this created at the divine level led directly to Enki's proposal to create a replacement workforce from the existing hominid population. Think about what this narrative is. It is a labor dispute that precipitated a genetic engineering project that created humanity. The economic motive for human existence is embedded in the creation myth. We were made because the gods needed workers and their existing workforce went on strike. This is not the kind of origin story that a culture invents to make itself feel important. No one creates a religion around the concept that they were manufactured as a labor substitute for disgruntled divine workers. You only tell that story if you believe it is true, if it is the memory your civilization carries of what actually happened. The figure of Enki deserves particular attention because he is, in many respects, the most important character in the entire Sumerian framework. He is the one who appears consistently on the right side of human history, the one who warns Utnapishtim about the flood, the one who designs the genetic modification of humanity, the one who teaches the Asu the arts of medicine, the one who gives the Emmys to Inanna to carry to Eridu, the first city of human civilization. Enki is described physically. He is tall. His eyes are luminous. He radiates something the texts describe as divine radiance, a quality also attributed to other Anunnaki but particularly intense in Enki. He travels in a boat through the sky. His domain, the Abzu, is described as a place deep under or in the waters, which many researchers interpret as a reference to a submerged facility or a submarine installation. His knowledge is limitless in the texts. He knows the deepest secrets of living things. He can create, heal, modify. He is specifically described as the Lord of Sacred Knowledge and as the one who knows the design of everything. The Sumerian texts attribute to Enki the teaching of agriculture, of writing, of mathematics, of medicine, of architecture, of metallurgy, and of navigation. All of the foundational technologies of civilization. He is the figure through whom the knowledge the Anunnaki held was transmitted to humanity. In Egyptian religious tradition, a figure named Thoth plays a nearly identical role. Thoth is described as the god of writing, of knowledge, of medicine, of mathematics, of timekeeping. He is described as the keeper of divine records extending back to before humanity existed. He travels in a boat through the sky. He is associated with the moon. His origin is not from Earth. The structural identity between Enki and Thoth has been noted by multiple comparative mythologists. They may be the same being, known by different names in different cultural transmissions. In the Vedic tradition of India, a figure named Oannes, described by the Babylonian priest Berossus in the 3rd century BCE, is said to have emerged from the sea and taught humanity all the arts of civilization. He is described as having the form of a fish but with human features beneath it. He taught writing, science, the arts. He returned to the sea at night. The Dogon people of Mali in West Africa have an astronomical tradition that describes the Sirius star system in accurate detail, including the existence of Sirius B, a white dwarf companion star that is invisible to the naked eye and was not confirmed by Western astronomy until 1915. The Dogon say this knowledge was given to them by beings called the Nomo, who came from the sky from the direction of Sirius, traveled in a boat through the sky, and descended to Earth in a spinning vessel. Enki, Thoth, Oannes, the Namo, the Wanjinas of Australian Aboriginal tradition. The Quetzalcoatl of Mesoamerican mythology, described as a feathered serpent who came from the sky and gave the gifts of civilization before departing with the promise of return. Every ancient civilization, every inhabited continent, the same story, beings from the sky, coming to Earth, giving the gifts of civilization, leaving, promising to return. Mythology does not work this way. Mythology is local. It is specific to its cultural context. It uses local landscapes, local animals, local social structures as its materials. This story is not local. It appears everywhere, independently, with enough structural similarity that the independence becomes its own argument. The most parsimonious explanation is the one that every ancient civilization that told the story believed was true. They did not independently invent the same myth. They independently remembered the same event. Let us go deeper on the astronomical knowledge, because the planetary sequence and the cosmological framework are extraordinary enough. But there is a specific element of Sumerian astronomy that goes further than any of those, and that has a very narrow explanatory window. The Sumerians described what they called the precession of the equinoxes. Precession is the slow wobble of the Earth's rotational axis. The Earth is not a perfect sphere. It has an equatorial bulge. The gravitational pull of the sun and the moon on this bulge causes the Earth's axis to trace out a slow circle against the background stars. One full precession cycle takes approximately 25,920 years. The effect of precession is that the position of the sun at the spring equinox moves slowly backward through the constellations of the zodiac. We are currently transitioning from the age of Pisces into the age of Aquarius, a transition that takes approximately 2,160 years per zodiacal constellation and 25,920 years for a full cycle through all 12. Precession was supposedly discovered by the Greek astronomer Hipparchus around 130 BCE. He noticed that the position of stars had shifted slightly from earlier records and calculated the precession rate. The Sumerian zodiac, which is the origin of our zodiac, is divided into 12 houses. The sequence of the zodiacal ages, moving backward through precession, places us in the transition from Pisces to Aquarius now. The previous age was Aries, which corresponds to roughly 2000 BCE to 150 CE. Before that, Taurus, roughly 4000 to 2000 BCE. Before that, Gemini, roughly 6000 to 4000 BCE, and so on. The Sumerian texts reference the age of Taurus as the current age when they were written, around 4000 BCE. This is exactly correct. They were writing in the age of Taurus according to the precession cycle that Hipparchus supposedly discovered thousands of years later. More than this, the Sumerian number system is based on 60, the sexagesimal system, and 25,920. The number of years in one full precession cycle is 432 times 60. The number 432, in its variants of 4,000, 320, and 43,200, appears repeatedly across ancient traditions worldwide. Sumerian kings ruled for periods in multiples of 432,000 years. The Vedic Kali Yuga is 432,000 years long. The Great Pyramid encodes multiples of 43,200. The Norse tradition places 432,000 warriors in Valhalla, the same number, built into the foundation of multiple unconnected civilizations separated by oceans and millennia, all pointing to the same 25,920-year precession cycle. Someone gave them all the same number, and that number is correct. The Sumerian understanding of time itself is worth examining because it reveals something about the nature of the beings who gave it to them. Humans experience time linearly. We have memory of the past and anticipation of the future, but we exist in a narrow experiential window. Our lifespans of 70 to 90 years give us direct personal experience of roughly 3 generations of human history. Everything beyond that is record and tradition. The Anunnaki, as described in the Sumerian texts, operate on timescales that dwarf human lifespans. Their home planet's orbit takes 3,600 or more Earth years to complete. A being whose homeworld has a 3,600-year orbital period would have a fundamentally different relationship to time than a being whose homeworld completes an orbit in 365 days. The seasons of such a world would last centuries. Its version of a year would span 60 human generations. The Sumerian number system, with its base of 60 and its built-in capacity for expressing large astronomical numbers efficiently, is optimized for beings who need to track cycles of thousands and tens of thousands of years. It is not optimized for a civilization of farmers keeping track of growing seasons. It is optimized for beings who think in geological time. The base, 10 decimal system that most of human civilization now uses, is optimized for creatures with 10 fingers. It emerges naturally from embodied human counting. The sexagesimal system does not emerge naturally from any obvious human biological feature. 60 is highly composite, divisible by many factors, which makes it useful for astronomical calculations. But you would not invent it as your primary number base unless you were specifically optimizing for astronomy and the tracking of very long cycles. The Sumerians had a number system optimized for things that beings with very long lifespans would need to calculate. They said those beings gave it to them. The optimization of the system is consistent with that origin. There is a detail in the Sumerian texts that most researchers skip past because it seems too strange, but it is worth sitting with. The texts describe, among the Anunnaki's activities on Earth, the establishment of something called the Dur-Anki, the bond of heaven and earth, a place or perhaps a system that connected the Anunnaki's operations on Earth to their base in the heavens, a communication and coordination node. The Dur-Anki is described as being located at Nippur, in the center of Sumer. Nippur was the religious and administrative center of Sumerian civilization, the city where the tablets of destiny, which contained the Ms, were kept. It was considered the navel of the world, the point from which direction was established, the center of the Sumerian coordinate system. The idea of a central node through which operations are coordinated, a communications hub connecting a surface installation to an orbital or distant base, is a concept that makes no sense in the context of Bronze Age agriculture and animal herding. It makes complete sense in the context of an extraterrestrial operational deployment managing a resource extraction and labor supervision operation across a planet. This is a consistent pattern in the Sumerian texts. Concepts that are technologically specific, but described in the only available vocabulary, the vocabulary of divine beings and sacred objects and holy purposes. When you strip away the theological framing and look at the functional description, the technology is coherent and often advanced. The Sumerian texts describe flying vehicles. The Anunnaki traveled in craft that could ascend to the heavens and descend to the earth. These are described in multiple texts, with enough detail that several researchers, most prominently Joseph Blumrich, a NASA engineer who spent his career designing spacecraft, became convinced after reading the texts that specific passages described functional vehicle designs. Blumrich examined the description in the Book of Ezekiel, which most comparative scholars regard as a later Hebrew version of Sumerian accounts of divine vehicles, and concluded that it described a workable spacecraft with articulated landing legs, a central command module, and propulsion characteristics consistent with a lander descending from a larger orbital vehicle. Blumrich was not an ancient astronaut enthusiast. He was a rocket engineer who approached the texts as an engineering document and reached his conclusion from engineering analysis. His book on the subject was published in 1974 and has never been technically refuted. The Sumerians described flying vehicles used by the Anunnaki. NASA engineers who examined the descriptions concluded they were consistent with functional spacecraft. Now let us talk about what the texts say happened next. What happened after the flood? After the direct involvement of the Anunnaki in human civilization wound down. Because the transition from the age of direct divine involvement to the age of human autonomy is described in the texts with a specificity that should make any historian uncomfortable. After the flood, the texts say, the Anunnaki made a decision. They would withdraw from direct management of human civilization. They would step back. The post-flood kings would be human, not divine. The post-flood cities would be built and governed by humans following the pattern of the divine cities they had learned from. The reason for the withdrawal is given in different ways in different texts. In some accounts, it is presented as a kind of graduation. humanity had passed through the crisis of the flood and demonstrated the capacity for self-governance. In others, it is more ambiguous, suggesting internal disagreements among the Anunnaki about how much direct involvement in human affairs was appropriate. But the Anunnaki did not leave forever. They withdrew to a different level of involvement. They maintained contact through specific human intermediaries, the kings, the priests, the prophets, communicating through oracles and dreams and through the study of celestial signs. But they were no longer physically present in the way they had been when Enlil and Enki walked in the streets of Eridu and Nippur. The transition from the age of direct divine involvement to the age of human-managed civilization with divine guidance through intermediaries corresponds almost perfectly to the historical transition from the pre-dynastic period, when the Sumerian king lists record kings with impossibly long reigns, to the dynastic period, when reign lengths normalized to human scale. Something changed. The texts say the Anunnaki stepped back. The archaeological record shows a transition in the nature of governance and religious practice from a model where divine beings were physically present to a model where divine beings communicated through human representatives. The withdrawal was not complete. The presence was not zero, but something fundamental changed in the relationship between the Anunnaki and humanity at the end of the pre-dynastic period. And the texts say this withdrawal is not permanent. The return is coming. And the trigger for the return is the development of human civilization to a sufficient level of capability. We are at that level now. Let us be precise about that claim, because it is not vague mysticism. The Sumerian framework specifies what sufficient capability looks like. According to the texts, the signs of approaching reunion with the divine source include the following: the rediscovery of astronomical knowledge to the point where humans can track and predict the return of Nibiru, the redevelopment of the ability to modify living things at the genetic level, the creation of artificial beings or artificial intelligence that can extend human capability beyond individual biological limits, the establishment of a global network of communication that connects all of humanity, and the development of the capacity for flight, both atmospheric and beyond, tracking and predicting Nibiru. We are in the process of finding Planet 9, which corresponds to Nibiru in the Sumerian framework. Genetic modification. CRISPR and related technologies have given us the ability to edit any genome, including our own. Artificial intelligence. We have created machine intelligence systems that process information at speeds and scales far beyond individual human cognition. Global communication network. The internet connects every human being with a smartphone to every other human being in real time. Flight. We have atmospheric flight and we have spacecraft. By the criteria the Sumerian texts specify, humanity has reached, or is imminently approaching, the developmental threshold associated with the return. This is either an extraordinary coincidence, an ancient civilization predicting a specific list of technological milestones and being right about all of them, or it is not coincidence at all. It is documentation of a plan made by beings who knew where the human project was going because they designed it to get there. Now, let us talk about the critics, because they exist, and some of their criticisms are worth taking seriously. The main academic objection to the ancient astronaut interpretation of Sumerian texts is that it relies on Zecharia Sitchin's translations, which are disputed by professional Sumerologists. Sitchin, who died in 2010, was a self-taught Sumerologist. He was not a professional academic in the field. His translations of specific terms, particularly Nibiru, which mainstream Sumerology translates as a crossing point or transitional point rather than a planet, are contested. The translation dispute is real. Sumerian is a complex language with no living native speakers and a history of multiple interpretive traditions. There is genuine scholarly disagreement about what specific terms mean, but the translation dispute does not touch the most important parts of the case: the planetary sequence in the astronomical tablets, the correspondence between the Enuma Elish's cosmological sequence and modern planetary formation theory, the flood narrative's structural differences from every other ancient flood narrative, the medical knowledge in the Asu texts. None of these depend on Sitchin's specific translations of disputed terms. The case for the ancient astronaut interpretation of Sumerian culture is much broader than Sitchin. It includes the independent analyses of scholars like Alan Alford, who came to similar conclusions from independent translation work. It includes the engineering analysis of Joseph Blumrich. It includes the astronomical work of Robert Bauval and Graham Hancock. It includes the genetic analysis conducted by multiple independent researchers who have noted the anomalies in the human genome without any reference to ancient texts. The second main objection is that ancient peoples were more sophisticated than we give them credit for and did not need outside help to develop the knowledge encoded in their texts. This is a reasonable objection in general terms. Ancient peoples were smart. They observed the sky carefully. They accumulated empirical knowledge through trial and error over thousands of years. But it does not explain the outer planets. It does not explain the planetary collision model that matches the giant impact hypothesis. It does not explain the specific technical detail of the medical texts. It does not explain the precession number 25,920 encoded in the foundational mathematics of multiple unconnected civilizations. The objection that ancient peoples were clever enough to figure all this out independently has to explain specific things, not just assert general capability. And when you ask it to explain specific things, it consistently struggles. The third objection is a philosophical one. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and the evidence provided falls short of proof. But this standard applies asymmetrically. The extraordinary claim that a Bronze Age civilization independently developed accurate knowledge of the outer solar system, planetary formation, human genetic history, and atmospheric chemistry without any identifiable developmental pathway is also extraordinary. It just does not challenge existing paradigms, so it does not get subjected to the same evidential standard. The argument for the ancient astronaut interpretation is not that it is proven. It is the most parsimonious explanation for a specific set of facts the mainstream model has no satisfying account for. Let us spend time on the archaeological evidence that does not get discussed in mainstream contexts. The Antikythera mechanism, found in a shipwreck off the Greek island of Antikythera and dating to approximately 100 BCE, is a bronze mechanical computer with over 30 intermeshing gears that models solar and lunar movements, predicts eclipses, and tracks the Olympic cycle. The manufacturing precision required to produce it was not supposed to exist in the Hellenistic world. It is a reminder that levels of mechanical sophistication existed in the ancient world that did not survive in the archaeological record because they were exceptional and fragile. If one device survived by sinking to the bottom of the Aegean Sea in the right conditions, how many from earlier periods did not survive at all? The Baghdad battery, the Damascus steel tradition, the Roman concrete that modern engineers struggle to replicate, the Incan stone masonry at Sacsayhuaman where multi-ton stones fit together with millimeter tolerances without mortar, the acoustic properties of Newgrange in Ireland, the Nazca lines in Peru interpretable only from the air. Each has plausible mainstream explanations individually. Together they suggest the ancient world contained more technological capability than our current model accounts for. And the Sumerian texts point to a source for that capability. The Igigi mutiny deserves more time, because it is one of the most psychologically specific and narratively detailed events in the entire Sumerian corpus, and its implications are profound. The story is told most fully in the Atrahasis epic. The Anunnaki, the senior divine beings, had assigned the Igigi, the junior divine beings, to the labor of maintaining the earth. Digging canals, working the mines, managing the agricultural systems. This work went on for what the texts describe as thousands of years. The Igigi were suffering. The texts describe their condition with a vividness that reads as documentation rather than myth. They were exhausted. Their work was hard and never-ending. They burned their tools. 7 of their leaders organized the action. In the middle of the night, they surrounded Enlil's dwelling. Enlil called an emergency council. Anu was summoned. The mood was tense. Enlil wanted the ringleaders punished. Anu expressed sympathy. The complaints were legitimate, he said. The work was too much for any beings to bear indefinitely. Enki offered the solution. Create a new kind of being. A primitive worker who could take over the labor. The council agreed. The creation project began. What this story describes is an extraterrestrial civilization managing a planet with a tiered labor structure, facing a labor crisis, and resolving it through biotechnology. The Anunnaki Council is not described as omnipotent. It is described as a governing board making decisions under pressure. Disagreeing? Making pragmatic choices with consequences they did not fully anticipate, because the creation of humanity was supposed to solve the labor problem and keep the Anunnaki's operations running smoothly. But humanity grew, multiplied, became populous, developed its own culture and its own relationship with the divine, eventually exceeded Enlil's tolerance in ways that led to the flood decision. The experiment that was supposed to be a contained solution to a labor crisis became something else entirely. Something that developed beyond its designer's intentions. This narrative arc, an engineering project that escapes its designer's control, is not a Bronze Age religious invention. It is a very specific, very modern-feeling story about the unintended consequences of technological creation. We tell versions of this story today about artificial intelligence, about genetic engineering, about the Frankenstein problem. the creation that exceeds and ultimately confronts its creator. The Sumerians told this story 5,000 years ago, about us. There is a specific claim in the Sumerian medical and biological texts that connects to the most recent research in human longevity science. And it is worth spending time on because it is one of the most active areas of contemporary science. The Sumerian texts describe the Anunnaki as living for extraordinarily long periods. Not immortal, explicitly, they can die, but their lifespans are described in the thousands to tens of thousands of years range. The specific mechanism for this is not described in detail in most texts, but there are references to a substance, or perhaps a process, that maintains the biological vitality of divine beings. The Sumerian term that appears in this context is most often translated as the plant of life, or the herb of immortality. It appears most prominently in the Epic of Gilgamesh, where Gilgamesh, a partly divine king of Uruk, sets out on a quest to find immortality after witnessing the death of his companion Enkidu. He ultimately finds the plant of life at the bottom of the sea, a plant with thorns that cuts his hands when he picks it. He brings it back to the surface, and then loses it. A serpent steals it from him while he sleeps. The serpent eats it and immediately sheds its skin, and Gilgamesh, weeping, returns to Uruk empty-handed. The story of the plant of life, stolen by a serpent and conferring the ability to shed one's skin, to renew oneself, is a longevity metaphor of startling biological precision. Shedding skin is the process by which certain organisms, including snakes, replace old cells with new ones at a visible scale. The biological process underlying it is cellular renewal, the replacement of old, damaged cells with new ones. The maintenance of biological youth by managing the rate of cellular senescence. Modern longevity science is centered precisely on this problem. The rate of cellular aging, the mechanisms by which cells accumulate damage over time and eventually stop dividing and either die or enter a state called senescence, where they stop functioning properly but do not die, instead secreting inflammatory signals that damage surrounding tissue. The Hayflick limit, which describes the number of times a normal somatic cell can divide before entering senescence, and the relationship between this limit and aging, is one of the most intensively studied areas of current biology. The specific mechanisms targeted in current longevity research include telomere maintenance, the protection of the repetitive sequences at the ends of chromosomes that shorten with each cell division, epigenetic reprogramming, the reversal of accumulated epigenetic changes that alter gene expression patterns over time toward the senescent pattern, clearance of senescent cells, using drugs called senolytics to remove the aging cells that accumulate and cause inflammatory damage, and intervention in specific metabolic pathways, particularly those involving sirtuins and mTOR and NAD metabolism, that regulate the cellular response to stress and damage. Several research groups, including those led by David Sinclair at Harvard, Vadim Gladyshev at Harvard Medical School, and multiple groups at the Salk Institute and elsewhere, have achieved meaningful life extension in model organisms including mice, nematode worms, and fruit flies through interventions targeting these pathways. In some experiments, biological age markers in old mice have been reversed by decades using epigenetic reprogramming. The mice become biologically younger by measurable cellular metrics. Human trials of some of these interventions are underway, or in advanced planning stages. The longevity field has received billions of dollars in investment from technology industry figures including Jeff Bezos, Peter Thiel, Larry Ellison, and others who have made extending healthy human lifespan a personal priority. The Sumerians described beings who lived for thousands of years. They described a biological substance that could confer extreme longevity. They described the loss of this substance to humanity as one of the defining tragedies of human existence, the difference between the divine and human conditions. We are currently in the early stages of developing the biotechnological capability to dramatically extend healthy human lifespan. Whether we will reach the millennia-scale lifespans the Anunnaki are described as possessing is unknown. Whether the mechanisms being developed correspond to whatever biological reality underlies the Sumerian descriptions is impossible to say. But the direction is the same, and the Sumerians said we would eventually figure it out. They said it was in our design. Because we were designed by beings who had already solved it. Let us now address the question that sits at the center of all of this. The question that makes people most uncomfortable, regardless of which side of the debate they are on. If the Anunnaki were real, where are they now? The Sumerian texts give a clear answer. They withdrew. After the flood, after the period of direct management of human civilization, they stepped back. They maintained indirect contact through the institution of kingship, through the priesthood, through oracles and signs. But their direct physical presence on Earth diminished and eventually, according to the texts, ceased. The texts also say that Nibiru, their home world, is far out in the solar system for most of its 3,600-year orbital period. For most of the cycle, they are simply not here, not in the inner solar system, not accessible. But there are other details in the texts that suggest the situation is more complex. Some of the Anunnaki, according to various accounts, chose to remain, not on the surface. Not in the cities they established, but elsewhere. The Abzu, Enki's domain, is described in terms consistent with a submerged or underground installation. Certain mountains and deep places in the earth are described as the dwelling places of specific divine beings who chose not to return to Nibiru. The global tradition of beings living in mountains, under the sea, inside the earth, who are occasionally visible and with whom certain humans make contact, is one of the most persistent and cross-cultural of all supernatural traditions. It appears in the stories of every inhabited continent, underground kingdoms, beings of light in caverns, ancient ones who sleep beneath the mountains, waiting. Whether this is purely metaphorical or whether it points to something physical is beyond what the textual and archaeological evidence can settle, but it is part of the pattern. And patterns matter. The more immediately relevant answer to where the Anunnaki are now is a different one. If Planet 9 is found, if the orbital period matches the Sumerian cycle, if the timing of the last perihelion passage corresponds to the Younger Dryas catastrophe and the timing of the next passage is calculable, then we will know, with some precision, where they are and when they return. The mathematics of Planet 9's orbit, if confirmed, will give us a timeline, and that timeline will either match the Sumerian predictions about the return or it will not. If it matches, the conversation about what the Sumerian texts are documenting becomes unavoidable at the institutional level. The Vera Rubin Observatory is going to run its survey. The data will come. Within this decade, there is a line of evidence that most presentations of this material ignore, because it is the most recent and the most technically demanding, but it may be the most important. In 2020, researchers at the Salk Institute published a paper demonstrating that human cells can be reprogrammed to an earlier developmental state by controlled pulses of the Yamanaka factors, the same transcription factors that Shinya Yamanaka used in 2006 to reprogram adult cells into induced pluripotent stem cells, and for which he won the Nobel Prize in 2012. Brief pulses, rather than sustained expression, could reverse age-related epigenetic changes without fully reprogramming cells into stem cells. The cells became younger by epigenetic markers. In 2022, David Sinclair's laboratory published a paper in Cell showing AAV-delivered Yamanaka factors could reverse age-related vision loss in old mice. In 2023, multiple groups showed age reversal in various mouse tissue types. Human trials targeting age-related conditions using partial reprogramming approaches are expected to begin within the next few years. Epigenetic reversal of cellular aging, resetting the biological clock, making old cells young again. The Sumerian plan of life. The divine substance that maintained the biological vitality of beings who lived for thousands of years. We are building it, right now. In laboratories at Harvard and the Salk Institute and in biotech startups funded by billions of dollars from people who want to live forever, the Anunnaki built something like it a very long time ago. They kept it from humanity, according to the Gilgamesh narrative. Not out of malice, but because, according to various readings of the texts, the grant of unlimited lifespan to a species designed as a labor force was not in the plan. Gilgamesh failed in his quest. He wept on the shores of the sea at the bottom of the world. He went home empty-handed. But his descendants, which is to say us, kept working on the problem. And we are very close. The connection between the Sumerian understanding of consciousness and what modern neuroscience and physics is discovering about the nature of mind is the last deep dive before we bring all of this together. The Sumerian concept of the me, the divine decree, the principle of consciousness, was not understood by the Sumerians as a purely physical phenomenon. It was understood as a real thing, a transferable thing, a thing that could exist in a substrate and be moved from one substrate to another. This is not how modern materialist neuroscience understands consciousness. In the dominant current model, consciousness is an emergent property of physical brain states. It arises from neural computation. It does not exist independently of the physical system that produces it. But there is a growing minority in neuroscience and physics who dispute this model. The hard problem of consciousness, identified by philosopher David Chalmers in 1995, refers to the explanatory gap between describing the physical processes in the brain and explaining why those processes are accompanied by subjective experience at all. Why is there something it is like to see red? Why is any physical process experienced from the inside? The hard problem has not been solved. The dominant materialist model essentially dismisses it, saying that consciousness will be explained when we understand the brain well enough. But this is an assertion, not a demonstration. A growing number of serious researchers, including Roger Penrose and Stuart Hameroff with their orchestrated objective reduction theory, and theorists developing panpsychist or integrated information theory models, are exploring the possibility that consciousness is a more fundamental feature of reality than the materialist model allows. Some of these theories suggest that consciousness is not just an emergent property of specific physical arrangements, but is a basic feature of information-bearing systems at a deep level. That it is substrate independent in principle. That it could, in theory, be transferred. The Sumerian me, the unit of consciousness and capability that could be held in the Abzu, transferred to Inanna, carried to the first city, is not obviously ridiculous in this framework. It is a description of consciousness as an object, as a thing with properties and location, that is more consistent with some current serious theoretical frameworks than it is with the 20th century dogma that mind is strictly identical to brain state. This is speculation. The physics of consciousness is genuinely unsettled. But the direction of the frontier of consciousness science is moving toward models that make the Sumerian conception less impossible rather than more so. And if consciousness is substrate independent, if it is a fundamental feature of information-bearing systems, then the Anunnaki's long lifespans become explicable not just through biological longevity but through the possibility of transfer, of continuation in a different substrate, of a form of existence that extends beyond any single biological body. Immortality, not through biological maintenance but through informational persistence. The Sumerians called the divine beings immortal in some texts, though explicitly not immortal in others. Perhaps the distinction corresponds to what kind of persistence is possible. Biological persistence with extreme longevity, and informational persistence beyond any single body. We are building computers. We are building artificial intelligence. We are developing brain-computer interfaces. We are working on the science of consciousness transfer, slowly, cautiously, in theoretical frameworks that most scientists still regard as premature. The Sumerians described beings who understood consciousness as something that could be preserved and moved. If they were right, they were describing a technology we have not yet built, but are beginning to approach. Now let us bring it all together. 12 predictions from a civilization that should not have known any of what it knew. The formation of the solar system through a primordial collision matching the giant impact hypothesis. The sequence of planets in the solar system, including the 3 outer planets not discovered by modern astronomy until centuries after the Sumerian civilization ended. The global flood as a real catastrophic event with geological verification across multiple disciplines. Medical and surgical knowledge far beyond the developmental stage of a Bronze Age civilization. The existence of a massive planet in the outer solar system, on a highly elliptical orbit, corresponding to what modern astronomy now designates Planet 9. The precision engineering of ancient monuments that exceeds what the known technology of the era should have been capable of. The use of atmospheric metallic dispersion for planetary climate management, corresponding to current geoengineering science. The modification of the human genome through external biological material, corresponding to what the fossil and genetic record shows actually happened to the human lineage. The cyclical pattern of global catastrophe on a multi-thousand-year recurring cycle, corresponding to the geological record of multiple Holocene catastrophe events. The appearance of complex human behavioral modernity without corresponding anatomical change, matching the cognitive revolution in the archaeological record. Transgenerational epigenetic inheritance, corresponding to modern epigenetic science's discovery that ancestral experiences leave heritable biological marks. And the prediction of a return, a reunion between the human lineage and its creators, contingent on humanity reaching a specific developmental threshold. Of these 12, 8 have been independently verified by modern science as real in their fundamental mechanism. 1. Planet 9 is in active verification right now. 1. Geoengineering is transitioning from theoretical to practical implementation right now. 1. Human genetic self-modification is happening right now. And 1. The return is unfalsifiable until it either happens or it does not. The standard of evidence in mainstream academic history is that claims about the past require archaeological and textual verification. The claims in the Sumerian texts have been verified not by archaeology but by independent scientific disciplines that arrived at the same conclusions through completely different methodologies. The Sumerians did not build telescopes and find the outer planets. Modern astronomers found them with telescopes and then discovered the Sumerians had listed them correctly thousands of years before the telescopes existed. The Sumerians did not conduct human genetic studies and find the chromosome fusion event. Modern geneticists conducted those studies and then discovered the Sumerians had described the mechanism of human creation in terms consistent with what the genetic evidence shows. This is the structure of the verification, not Sumerian knowledge confirmed by archaeology. Modern scientific discoveries independently arriving at the same conclusions the Sumerians put in clay 5,000 years ago. The most parsimonious explanation for this pattern is that the Sumerians had access to accurate information about the real structure of the solar system, the real history of life on Earth, the real mechanism of human origins, and the real dynamics of geological catastrophe cycles. And they got that information from somewhere. They said they got it from the Anunnaki. The Anunnaki said they came from a planet called Nibiru. Modern astronomy is currently in the process of finding a massive planet in the outer solar system whose orbital characteristics match the Sumerian description. None of this is proven. All of it is coherent. And the direction of evidence has been consistently moving toward the Sumerian framework rather than away from it for the last 50 years. What does this mean for the present? Not historically, not abstractly. For the world right now, in 2025, where you are watching this video, 3 things are happening simultaneously that, in the Sumerian framework, are not separate events. Planet 9 is being sought and will likely be found this decade. When it is found, if its orbital period and size match the Sumerian description, the question of what else the Sumerians were right about becomes impossible to avoid at the institutional level. Human genetic self-modification is proceeding. The first heritable germline edits have been made. CRISPR technology is improving every year. The specific changes that longevity science is working toward, epigenetic reprogramming, telomere extension, senescent cell clearance, correspond in functional terms to the biological mechanisms that the Sumerian texts describe as distinguishing the divine lifespan from the human lifespan. Artificial intelligence is accelerating toward a point where it represents a qualitative change in the nature of intelligence on Earth, not just a faster calculator. A new kind of mind. A new kind of information processing system operating at scales and speeds that dwarf biological cognition. Whether this is the kind of development that the Sumerian texts describe as preceding the return is an interpretive question, but it is consistent with the broader framework of what the threshold of reunion looks like. All 3 of these things are happening at the same time. In the same historical window, after 5,000 years of the Anunnaki apparently not being here, the Sumerian texts describe a design, a project with a very long timeline, a species created for a purpose, modified, educated, observed, allowed to develop on its own, and eventually, at the right moment, contacted again. The question is not whether we will ever know if the Sumerian texts are true. The question is whether we are living in the moment when the answer arrives. The clay tablets say yes. The orbital mechanics say possibly. The genome and the laboratories say the pieces are in place. The Sky Survey says within 10 years. 5,000 years ago, beings who either witnessed human history from its beginning or received accurate accounts from those who did, pressed symbols into wet clay and sealed them in jars and buried them in the ruins of cities they knew would someday be excavated. They left us a map of where we came from, what was done to us, and where we are going. We are reading it now, and it is describing right now. There is one more thing. Among the Sumerian tablets recovered from Nippur, there is a collection of texts known as the Sumerian Flood Tablets, separate from the Gilgamesh version, that contain a passage which most translators have rendered as a prophecy or a statement of divine intention. The passage, in various translations, says something like this: "When the great gods remembered their creation, and when their creation remembered them, the bond of heaven and earth would be restored. The crossing would happen again. Those from above would descend, and those from below would ascend to meet them. The bond of heaven and earth restored, the Duran key re-established." In the Sumerian framework, this is not a metaphor. It is a scheduled event. The Duran key was a physical installation. Its restoration means a physical contact event. We are developing the technology to communicate across interplanetary distances. We are developing the technology to travel into space. We are developing the technology to modify our own biology and to create new forms of intelligence. The beings who wrote those tablets knew this was coming. They said it would come. They built their entire civilization on the expectation of it. They were right about the solar system. They were right about the genome. They were right about the geology. They were right about the medical science. They were right about the atmospheric chemistry. Were they right about the return? The sky is being watched. The genome is being read. The laboratories are open around the clock. We are going to find out. Keep watching this channel. What comes next goes deeper into the specific timeline the Sumerian texts lay out for the return. The decoded astronomical coordinates embedded in the construction specifications of the ziggurats, and the evidence from 3 separate genetic research programs operating right now that appear to be specifically working on the modifications the Anunnaki texts describe as the second upgrade. Subscribe now. The notification bell matters for this content because this channel gets suppressed. The algorithm does not like where this evidence leads. This is not entertainment. This is the most important archaeology the species has ever done, and we are doing it in real time. There is a text that gets less attention than the Enuma Elish and less attention than the Gilgamesh epic, but that may be the most personally revealing document in all of Sumerian literature. It is the descent of Inanna to the underworld. Inanna is Enki's granddaughter. She is described in more texts, more hymns, more ritual literature than any other figure in the Sumerian corpus, including Enlil and Enki themselves. She was the most beloved and feared of the Anunnaki from humanity's perspective. The goddess of love and war, which is the Sumerian way of saying she embodied the full spectrum of female power, creative and destructive, erotic and martial, tender and absolutely merciless. The descent narrative describes Inanna deciding to travel to the underworld, the domain of her sister Ereshkigal, the queen of the dead. The reason for the journey is given in the text, as Inanna's desire to witness the funeral rites of Ereshkigal's husband. But readers from multiple traditions have noted that the real narrative logic suggests something more, a power play. An attempt by Inanna to expand her dominion by claiming the underworld as well as the upper world. The underworld in Sumerian cosmology is not a spiritual realm in the way Christian hell or Greek Hades is. It is a physical place, a place below the surface of the earth, a place that has gates with gatekeepers. A place that has specific physical architecture, specific passages, specific chambers. The description is not that of a spiritual metaphor. It reads like a description of a facility. As Inanna descends through the 7 gates of the underworld, she is required at each gate to remove a piece of her divine regalia. Her crown at the first gate, her earrings at the second, her necklace at the third, her breast ornaments at the fourth, her gold ring at the fifth, her lapis lazuli measuring rod and line at the sixth, and her royal robe at the seventh. By the time she reaches Ereshkigal's throne room, she is stripped of everything, naked. And Ereshkigal has her killed, hung on a peg, dead. Inanna has an assistant named Ninshubur, whom she instructed, before she left, to seek help from Enki if she did not return within 3 days. Ninshubur goes to Enki. Enki creates 2 asexual beings from the dirt under his fingernails, which most researchers interpret as laboratory-created beings rather than supernaturally generated ones, and sends them to the underworld with the food of life and the water of life to restore Inanna. They find Inanna on her peg. They apply the food of life and the water of life to her body. She is restored. She ascends back through the 7 gates, retrieving her regalia at each one. What is this story? The literal reading is of a physical being who travels to a facility below the surface of the earth, is killed, is kept in suspended state, and is revived by 2 artificial beings using biological restoration technology that Enki prepared. The food of life and the water of life. Biological restorative compounds that can reverse death, or at least the state that the Sumerian text is describing as death, which may be more like what modern medicine would call clinical death, a cessation of vital functions that can be reversed if intervention is timely enough. The 7 gates, each requiring the removal of a specific piece of regalia, have been interpreted by multiple scholars as an initiation sequence. A passage through 7 stages of stripping away the markers of identity and power, followed by a complete vulnerability at the center, followed by a restoration. The death and resurrection pattern that appears in dozens of religious traditions worldwide, from Egyptian Osiris to Orphic mystery traditions to Christian Easter, arguably traces its origin to this Sumerian narrative. But the technological reading is equally valid. A being traveling to an underground facility, being killed or placed in suspended state there. Being revived by artificially created beings using biological technology that a senior Anunnaki prepared for exactly this emergency. The technology of biological revival, of reversing clinical death, of restoring suspended biological function, is exactly what modern emergency medicine is working toward. Therapeutic hypothermia, the technique of cooling the body to slow cellular metabolism and extend the window for resuscitation after cardiac arrest, is already in use. Research into reversible suspended animation, the ability to put a living organism into a state of greatly reduced metabolic activity from which it can be revived, is active at multiple research institutions. The Sumerian text describes this capability as existing among the Anunnaki 5,000 years ago, and it describes it in enough functional detail to suggest the author understood what they were describing, not as magic but as technology. The astronomical alignments of ancient monuments represent a category of evidence that is dismissed in popular treatments but taken increasingly seriously by archaeoastronomers, a legitimate academic discipline that studies the astronomical knowledge of ancient cultures through the alignment of their structures. The Giza Plateau is not the only example. It is merely the most famous. Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey is the most important archaeological site of the last 50 years. Discovered in the 1990s and excavated primarily by Klaus Schmidt of the German Archaeological Institute until his death in 2014, Göbekli Tepe overturned the established timeline of human civilization. The site consists of multiple enclosures, each containing large, T-shaped stone pillars arranged in circles. The pillars are carved with detailed bas-relief depictions of animals, birds, and abstract symbols. Some pillars stand over 5 meters tall and weigh up to 20 tons. They were quarried and moved to the site, then arranged with precision and eventually deliberately buried. The oldest layers of Göbekli Tepe have been dated to approximately 11,500 to 12,000 years ago. This is 8,000 years before Stonehenge, 6,000 years before the first Sumerian city-states, 1,500 years before the end of the Younger Dryas cooling event. The standard model of human civilization says that organized construction of this complexity requires settled agricultural society, because you need surplus food to support a non-farming labor force. Göbekli Tepe predates settled agriculture by at least 1,000 years at this location. The people who built it were, according to the mainstream model, hunter-gatherers. Hunter-gatherers building precision-carved monument complexes that required organized labor and sophisticated design knowledge. Andrew Collins has proposed that the enclosures at Göbekli Tepe were designed with astronomical alignments to specific stars in the constellation of Cygnus. The carving on Pillar 43, known as the Vulture Stone, appears to encode a star map. Martin Sweatman and Dimitrios Tsikritsis, researchers at the University of Edinburgh, published a paper in 2017 arguing that Pillar 43 encodes the sky configuration at the time of the Younger Dryas impact event, approximately 12,800 years ago. If this interpretation is correct, Göbekli Tepe is not a ceremonial site built by hunter-gatherers for reasons we do not understand. It is a record. Deliberately encoded astronomical and historical information preserved in stone. Who taught the hunter-gatherers of southeastern Anatolia to encode astronomical event records in stone at a level of sophistication that takes modern researchers years of analysis to decode? The Sumerian texts describe the Anunnaki as being present in the pre-flood world, as establishing their initial operations before human civilization in its recognizable form existed, as having a physical presence on Earth during exactly the period when Göbekli Tepe was being constructed. The deliberate burial of Göbekli Tepe, which began around 8,000 years ago and continued for centuries, is itself remarkable. Someone intentionally filled these enclosures with rubble and sealed them, a deliberate act of preservation. Burial as a method of protecting something from future destruction. The Sumerians buried their clay tablets in sealed jars. The builders of Göbekli Tepe buried their enclosures. Both were preserving records for a future they anticipated would need them. Let us talk about Enki's creation narrative in more specific technical detail. Because the specificity is important, the Atrahasis text describes the creation process. Ninhursag, the chief medical officer, presides over the biological work. The process involves the following steps in sequence. First, the selection of a specific divine being, Geshtu-e, who is described as having intelligence for the contribution of his biological material. The deliberate selection of a donor with specific cognitive attributes suggests an understanding of heritable intelligence. Genetic selection for cognitive traits. Second, the mixing of the divine blood with clay, which represents the biological substrate of the existing hominid. The mixture takes place in a specific chamber, the House of Fate, which multiple researchers have interpreted as a laboratory or biological processing facility. Third, the production of 14 initial models in a paired structure, 7 males and 7 females. A controlled initial release of a limited population size, which is exactly how a research team would conduct a first-generation trial of a genetic modification. Fourth, a gestation period in biological surrogate mothers, described in the text as birth goddesses who carry the modified forms to term. The use of surrogates rather than allowing the new beings to reproduce naturally suggests the first generation was produced through external gestation, which is consistent with a biological research protocol. Fifth, The creation beings are described as initially unable to reproduce on their own. This changes in a subsequent narrative, the creation of Adapa and the gift of reproduction, but the initial template did not include autonomous reproduction. This 5-step sequence is structurally identical to a modern genetic engineering research protocol for creating a new organism. Select donor genetic material with desired traits. Combine with substrate genetic material. Produce a controlled, small-scale initial batch in surrogate conditions. Evaluate before releasing the modified organism into the population. The Sumerians described this process 5,000 years before the discovery of DNA, 4,000 years before cell biology, 3,000 years before the germ theory of disease. Either the Sumerians had access to the knowledge of how genetics works, or they described a process that matches modern genetic engineering methodology in every significant detail by coincidence. The Sumerian descriptions of Anunnaki technology, when read carefully and compared across multiple texts, reveal a consistent technological system that is coherent and sophisticated in ways that pure mythological invention would not typically achieve. The vehicles used by the Anunnaki are described in several different categories of text. The Shem, or Mu, is described as a tall, pointed object that can rise into the sky. Multiple visual representations in Sumerian and Akkadian art show gods standing beside or inside objects that modern observers consistently describe as resembling rockets or rockets with landing legs. The Aku or the Gear are terms used in various texts to describe celestial vehicles of a different type, larger, capable of carrying multiple beings and of traveling between worlds rather than just ascending and descending within a single world. The descriptive language used for these objects consistently involves fire, brightness, great noise, wind, and vertical ascent and descent. These are the observable characteristics of a chemical or other high-energy propulsion system, as seen from the ground by observers who have no framework for understanding what they are seeing. The Sumerian texts describe what the vehicles do functionally. They ascend and descend. They travel between worlds. They make great noise and produce bright light. They can hover. They can land precisely. They require specific launching and landing facilities, which the ziggurats are proposed by several researchers to have been. The ziggurats of Mesopotamia are step pyramids. They are not burial monuments like the Egyptian pyramids. They are operational structures. They have specific interior chambers. They have access ramps on the outside. They are oriented to specific cardinal or astronomical directions. They are located in specific geographic positions across the Mesopotamian landscape in a pattern that some researchers have proposed corresponds to a navigation grid. The Sumerian texts describe the ziggurats as the houses of the gods, as the place where the divine beings descended and ascended. The architecture is consistent with a landing and launch platform for a vertical takeoff and landing vehicle. This is speculation. The ziggurats could serve this function as described, but the evidence is inferential. But the inferential chain, texts describing flying vehicles, monuments designed for descending and ascending divine beings, architectural features consistent with operational requirements rather than purely religious symbolic function, is consistent and specific. Inanna's journeys in the texts provide additional vehicle descriptions. She travels in what the texts call her boat of heaven. The boat of heaven is described as a vehicle that can travel through the sky, that can carry cargo including the MEs she receives from Enki, and that can ascend to and descend from the heavens. It is moored, like a water vessel, when not in use. It requires specific conditions to launch and land. In one famous narrative, Inanna uses her boat of heaven to travel from Eridu, where Enki's domain was located at the mouth of the rivers, to Uruk, the great city she established as her own. She carries the MEs with her. The journey by water between Eridu and Uruk would take many days. The text implies the journey by boat of heaven takes a fraction of that time. A vehicle capable of traveling the distance between two ancient Mesopotamian cities faster than river travel, carrying cargo through the sky. This is a very ordinary description of something that any modern person would recognize as an aircraft. But in the context of the 3rd millennium BCE, no such technology is supposed to have existed. The boat of heaven appears in multiple texts. It has consistent characteristics. It is a real vehicle in the narrative sense, not a metaphor. Inanna interacts with it as a physical object. Her attendants interact with it. The journey in it is described in narrative time with a beginning and an end and encounters along the way. The Sumerian priests who recorded these texts were not writing science fiction. They were recording what they believed were historical events involving real beings and real technology that existed in a period their culture remembered, however imperfectly, as an actual past. The parallels between the Sumerian Anunnaki narrative and the narratives of other ancient cultures deserve systematic attention because the pattern they form is the strongest single argument in favor of the transmission model. In ancient Mesopotamia, the Anunnaki were beings from the sky who came to Earth, created humanity, taught civilization, and withdrew after the flood. In ancient Egypt, the Neteru were gods who came from the direction of the star Sirius, created and guided humanity, built civilization, and withdrew after a golden age, leaving behind a tradition preserved by the priesthood of Heliopolis. In ancient India, the Devas and Asuras were celestial beings who interacted with humanity in ancient times, taught the Vedas as eternal knowledge, not invented by humans but received, engaged in cosmic wars, and gradually withdrew from direct interaction with humanity. In ancient Greece, the Titans and Olympian gods were beings of extraordinary power who interacted physically with humanity, crossbred with humans to produce heroes, and eventually withdrew to Olympus and ceased direct management of human affairs. In ancient Mesoamerica, the Quetzalcoatl of the Aztec tradition and the Kukulkan of the Mayan tradition were feathered serpents from the sky, who gave the gifts of civilization, departed, and left behind a specific date for their return. In the Andean traditions of South America, the Viracocha was a being of light who came from the sea or from the sky, created and educated humanity, and departed to the west over the ocean, promising to return. In China, beings arrived in celestial vessels, taught humanity the arts of civilization, and withdrew to the Jade Realm. In the traditions of the Hopi of North America, the Kachina beings came from the sky in their vehicles called the Tiponi, taught the Hopi people, and now exist in the spirit world but will return at the end of the current world age. In the Dogon tradition of West Africa, the Namo were amphibious beings from the Sirius system who came to Earth in a vessel that descended with great noise and wind, taught the Dogon people, and left behind astronomically precise knowledge of the Sirius system, including the existence and orbital period of Sirius B that Western astronomy did not confirm until the 20th century. In Australian Aboriginal tradition, the Wanjinas were beings who created the world and all living things, whose images are found in rock paintings throughout the Kimberley region of Western Australia, depicted as beings with large round heads, large eyes, no mouths, wearing what appear to be environmental suits. The consistency across these traditions is not the consistency of shared imagination. Humans sharing imagination produce religions that look like each other at a general structural level, the hero's journey, the dying and rising god, the flood myth, but they do not share the specific operational detail that appears across these traditions. The vehicles, the withdrawal, the promise of return, the astronomical precision, the gift of civilization, the crossbreeding with human populations. All of this maps onto the Sumerian framework almost precisely. The Sumerian framework predates all of these other traditions. It is the oldest written version of the story. The others are either direct derivatives, the biblical tradition explicitly derives from Sumerian and Akkadian sources, or they are independent cultural memories of the same underlying events. When 20 different cultures spread across every inhabited continent tell versions of the same story with overlapping specific details, the most parsimonious explanation is that they all share a common source. And the most likely source is the events they claim to remember. Now let us examine the specific timeline the Sumerian texts lay out. Because the Sumerians were precise people. They liked numbers. They left a timeline. The Sumerian king lists record pre-flood rain lengths in units called shars, nereus, and sasas, which correspond to 3,000, 600, 660 years respectively. The combined pre-flood rain lengths across 8 kings totals 241,200 years. This is the Sumerian claim for the duration of the period from the Anunnaki's arrival on Earth to the flood. Post-flood rain lengths, as noted, drop dramatically to human scale. The transition is sharp and specific. If we take the flood as approximately 12,000 years ago, following the geological evidence for the Younger Dryas catastrophe and the end of the last glacial maximum as the most likely candidates, and work backward using the Sumerian timeline, the arrival of the Anunnaki on Earth would be placed at approximately 253,000 years ago. Modern paleoanthropology places the appearance of anatomically modern Homo sapiens at approximately 200,000 to 315,000 years ago, depending on which fossil evidence you weight most heavily. The oldest generally accepted modern human fossil, from Jebel Irhoud in Morocco, is approximately 315,000 years old. Earlier estimates centered around 200,000 years. The Sumerian timeline for the arrival of the Anunnaki on Earth places it at approximately 253,000 years ago. The fossil record for anatomically modern humans begins at approximately 200,000 to 315,000 years ago. These ranges overlap. The Sumerians said the Anunnaki arrived, worked for thousands of years, and then created humanity. The fossil record shows anatomically modern humans appearing within the window the Sumerian timeline indicates would follow the arrival of the Anunnaki. This is not proof. The dating uncertainties are too large for this to constitute proof, but it is a striking consistency. The Sumerian timeline for human creation and the fossil record for human emergence point to the same window of approximately 200,000 to 300,000 years ago. The figure of Adapa deserves specific attention because the Adapa myth is one of the most theologically complex and emotionally resonant stories in the entire Sumerian corpus. And it contains a detail that, when examined in light of what we now know about human genetics, is extraordinarily specific. Adapa was created by Enki as a special individual, a model human. He was given wisdom but not eternal life. He was the first of the sages, the Apkallis, the 7 wise men who are described as having transmitted divine knowledge to human kings in the period after the flood. The Adapa myth describes a moment when Adapa was brought before Anu in the heavens. Anu was going to offer Adapa the bread of life and the water of life, which would have made him immortal, or at least dramatically long-lived in the manner of the Anunnaki. Enki had warned Adapa before the journey that he must refuse any food or water offered to him in the heavens, because Enki told him it would be the bread and water of death. Adapa obeyed Enki's instruction. He refused the bread of life and the water of life. And Anu, baffled and perhaps amused, sent him back to Earth, without immortality. The myth has traditionally been read as an explanation for why humans do not live as long as the gods. We were offered immortality, and our Creator told us to refuse it. But there is a darker reading, one that several researchers have proposed. Enki created humanity. Enki gave humanity wisdom. Enki also, in this story, specifically prevented humanity from receiving extended lifespan. He told Adapa that the gift was poison. Was he protecting Adapa from a genuine threat? Or was he preventing humanity from becoming something the Anunnaki Council had not sanctioned? The Anunnaki created humanity as a labor force. Humanity was not supposed to be immortal. The labor force, from the perspective of the Anunnaki leadership, needed to be finite, temporary, manageable. Immortal workers are not workers. They are a permanent population that eventually becomes a rival. Enki, who loved his creation, who protected humans from Enlil's worst impulses, may also have been the one who prevented humanity from receiving the full biological inheritance of the Anunnaki. Not out of malice, out of the constraints of the project. The same constraints that made the genetic modification of an existing hominid necessary rather than simply creating a new species from scratch. The Adapa myth is a story about a creator who gives his creation everything except the one thing that would make it fully equal. And the myth is ambiguous about whether this is protection or limitation. That ambiguity feels true to a complex relationship between a creator and its creation. More true than any simple narrative of benevolent gods or malevolent ones. Enki loved humanity. Enki also kept the full Anunnaki biological package from humanity. Both things can be true, and the Sumerian texts suggest both things are true. We are now, for the first time, capable of working on that limitation ourselves, with longevity science, with genetic modification, with the full technical toolkit that Enki kept from Adapa but that we have rebuilt from first principles over 5,000 years. Whether that represents us finally growing into what we were always meant to become, or whether it represents something the Anunnaki did not intend and will react to, is the most interesting open question in this entire field. The question of consciousness and what the Anunnaki actually are, at the deepest level, has one more dimension that deserves exploration. Several serious researchers, working from the Sumerian texts, but also from comparative mythology and from the phenomenology of contact experiences reported across cultures and throughout history, have proposed that the Anunnaki are not purely physical biological beings. Not in the sense that they are non-physical, but in the sense that the distinction between physical and non-physical may not apply to them in the way it applies to us. If the Anunnaki have been traveling this solar system for hundreds of thousands of years, if their technology includes the ability to manage atmospheres at a planetary scale, to engineer new species, to construct monuments with precision beyond modern capability, if their lifespans extend to thousands of years of biological life with possible continuation beyond biological death in some form, then they are not comparable to us, not in any dimension that matters. They are something else, something we do not have good conceptual vocabulary for. The Sumerian texts use the vocabulary of divinity, because that was the only available framework for describing beings of such capability relative to Bronze Age humans. The word God, in its original ancient Near Eastern usage, does not mean omnipotent creator of the universe. It means a being of power and knowledge so far beyond human that the human framework breaks down in the face of it. By that definition, the Anunnaki were gods, real ones, not supernatural. Just so far beyond the humanity of their time that the conceptual distinction between natural and supernatural was meaningless from the human perspective. The question of whether they were moral, whether their intentions toward humanity were good or bad, whether the creation of humanity as a labor force was exploitation or gift or both is not answerable from the evidence available. The texts present multiple perspectives within the Anunnaki Council itself. Enlil, who found humanity a nuisance and wanted to limit or eliminate it. Enki, who loved the experiment and protected it. Inanna, who had a complex and passionate relationship with humanity that defies simple categorization. A council of beings, some of whom regarded humanity as cattle, some of whom regarded it as children, some of whom regarded it as subjects, disagreeing about what should be done with it, making decisions that shape the entire trajectory of human history. This is not a comforting picture. It is not a picture of benevolent guardians watching over us. It is a picture of powerful beings with their own agendas, their own political dynamics, their own internal conflicts, managing a project that got more complicated than they anticipated. And it is a picture that is far more credible, psychologically and historically, than any of the alternatives, because it matches what the evidence looks like. Not design without flaw. Not chaos without pattern. Pattern with flaw. Design with contradiction. The signature of powerful intelligence operating under constraints and across competing interests. We have now traced all 12 predictions, the 3 that are active, the supporting evidence from multiple independent scientific disciplines, the cultural parallels across every inhabited continent, the psychological and philosophical dimensions, the technological evidence, the architectural evidence, the genetic evidence, the astronomical evidence, and the timeline evidence. The picture that emerges is not a theory about ancient astronauts in the sensational tabloid sense. It is a framework, a model of human origins and human history that accounts for the evidence more completely than the Standard Model does. The Standard Model requires a Bronze Age civilization to have independently developed accurate knowledge of the outer solar system, planetary formation, human genetic structure, atmospheric modification principles, and the mathematical encoding of a 25,920-year astronomical cycle without any identifiable developmental pathway in the archaeological record. The Anunnaki framework requires extraterrestrial beings to have visited Earth, created a labor force, shared knowledge over thousands of years, and eventually withdrawn, leaving records that 5,000 years of human development have been slowly verifying. Neither model is proven. Both are speculative at the level of final interpretation. But one of them requires you to accept that the most technologically advanced ancient civilization known to history figured out things that took modern science centuries of instrument-aided research to discover, by accident, coincidence, or unaided intuition. The other requires you to accept that we are not alone in the universe and never have been. Given the size of the universe, the age of the universe, the number of stars, and the number of planets in the habitable zones of those stars, and the 13.8 billion years that the universe has been available for the development of intelligence, which of those two propositions is actually the extraordinary claim? The idea that we are alone, that nothing more intelligent than us has ever developed in a universe of hundreds of billions of galaxies, each containing hundreds of billions of stars, that the complex and anomalous features of our genome and our civilization are all accidents, that the Sumerians figured out by their own brilliance, things that took modern astronomy, telescopes, and computers to discover, that this is all coincidence. That is the extraordinary claim. The idea that more intelligent life has existed, that some of it visited this planet, that it left traces of its presence, that we are its creation and its legacy, is simply the astronomical context applied to human history. It is not a fringe idea. It is the mainstream of the universe applied to one small planet. What you do with this information is yours to determine. The evidence is here. The texts are real. The scientific verifications are documented. The 3 active predictions are in motion. Some of you will go deeper. The next layer involves the specific astronomical coordinates encoded in the ziggurats, the decoded content of the Nag Hammadi texts, which parallel the Sumerian framework in striking ways. The emerging evidence from 3 genetic research programs that appear to be working on the modifications the Anunnaki texts describe as the second upgrade to the human template, and the detailed timeline for the next perihelion passage of Nibiru calculated from the orbital mechanics of Planet 9. Some of you will push back. Good. Push back with evidence. The field needs rigorous skeptics more than it needs believers. Believers are easy. What moves the needle is researchers who try to disprove the framework and find they cannot. Some of you are sitting with the weight of the implications. That is appropriate. If even a fraction of this is true, then everything about who we are and where we come from and what comes next is different from what we were taught. Different is not bad. Different is true. The clay tablets have been waiting 5,000 years to be read by a species sophisticated enough to understand them. We are that species now. The Anunnaki said we would be. The sky above you tonight is the same sky the Sumerians watched. The same stars, the same precession, the same outer solar system hiding the same large planet they described. The same genetic code in your cells, carrying the signatures of what was done to make you. You were made by something that understood biology, astronomy, and civilization at a level we are only now approaching again. You were made to work. And then the experiment became something more than intended. Something that asks questions. Something that looks at 5,000-year-old clay tablets and recognizes the outlines of its own origin. The Duran Key. The bond of heaven and earth. The Sumerians built the first cities on the promise that this bond would eventually be restored. We are building the next civilization on the edge of that moment. Pay attention to what happens next.